Chapter 1, Prologue. Chapter Text. Where are we going? A young voice called from the back of the car as it cruised through the suburbs of a very rich district in Burke. Hiccup was sat in the back seat of his father's car as they drove through their neighborhood, his father having a specific destination in mind. Hiccup wasn't a very big child, especially at the age of 5. He was lean and unimpressive unlike his father, and his lean figure meant he was underweight and weak compared to the other kids. However, this didn't stop Hiccup from being himself and enjoying his time as a child, not knowing why he was so much smaller and weaker than the other kids, but still trying to fit in. His father, on the other hand, was tall, strong and built like a semi-truck that he could probably lift with his little finger whilst holding a tornado with his other hand. His name was Stoic Haddock, a proud man and a man of the people, his family name running for generations and dating back to the first civilizing people upon the island of Burke. Stoic was not an incredibly smart man, like his son, however, he could hold his own in business. He was the chairman of his company, Valker and Haddock Company, since he was a young man. Stoic had named the business after himself and his wife, Valker, who sadly passed away when Hiccup was born. Stoic gazed up into the rearview mirror and met eyes with his son. His face wrinkled as a proud, beaming smile spread across his face at the innocent, curious eyes of his son sitting in the back of his car. With a hearty chuckle and a friendly smile, Stoic spoke happily as though they were going somewhere exciting. "We're going to meet a friend of mine. He told me he has a daughter of his own, and she's about your age." Stoic smiled warmly, but Hiccup closed up slightly at the mention of meeting new people. Hiccup hadn't always been an extroverted soul, but his father was a charming social butterfly and was constantly dragging Hiccup along to meet any new clients or friends of his that he met along his journeys. Lowering his gaze away from his father, and out of the window, Hiccup gave a small sigh as he thought back to the last time he had met a kid his age. "Hiccup!" Stoic called out, earning the young boy's attention instantly, his tone dropping slightly as he looked back at his son at a stoplight ahead. "It won't be like last time, I promise you. You are a special kid, and some people just don't see it. But your mother and I see it, and that's why we love you. So just..." Stoic paused for a moment as he tried to think of the right words as he turned back to drive away. "Be yourself." Hiccup gave his father a bright smile, his father's words offering him more comfort and enthusiasm than his father had first anticipated. However, glad to see that his son was more positive about the meeting, Stoic pulled into a grand-looking house with a long, gravel driveway leading up to its entrance. Hiccup was in awe at the sight of the giant house looming ahead of him, his mouth momentarily dropping open as he took in its size. He always thought that his house was big, but this house seemed almost twice the size, when in actuality it only had an extra room than Hiccup's house. As the car pulled to a stop, Stoic turned around to see his son already struggling to unbuckle his seatbelt from his booster seat and jump out of the car. Chuckling at his son's excitement to see the giant house, Stoic laid a gentle hand upon Hiccup's knee, the hand itself almost covering both his knees under its size. "Now son," Hiccup looked up to meet his dad's eye, "I'm going to tell you a secret about these people we're about to meet, but you've got to promise that you won't say a word." Hiccup nodded enthusiastically, causing Stoic to take a large intake of breath. "The girl that's your age, might be the girl that you're going to marry in the future. I made a promise to her father that when you turn 25 and are still without a wife or a kid of your own, you will marry his daughter." Stoic explained simply, his words clear and obvious to the boy sitting before him. "I know it may seem confusing to you right now, or unfair to you in the future, but it is a promise I made with him from fear of not having grandchildren when I grow old." Stoic sighed sadly, knowing his words wouldn't make much sense to a child of Hiccup's age, but he felt his son deserved to know why he was there. "And I know that you'll hate me because of this when you are older, I just hope that you'll find a way to understand." Hiccup wasn't confused about his father's words, understanding each one as they fell from his lips. But his face contorted into an expression of confusion as his father finished his words, gauging his son's face for any disagreement or distaste for the idea, not wanting to go through with the promise. Especially if his son disliked the idea already. But Hiccup remained impassive, his face unchanged a second before he looked confused and curious. "What if I don't like her?" Hiccup asked as his innocent mind believed that he wouldn't be forced to marry a woman he doesn't love. However, he has not been exposed to the rest of the world yet, and its many flaws. What if we don't get along? Am I supposed to marry her if I cannot be friends with her? Stoic let out another short sigh and lowered his head, unsure how to answer his son's reasonable response. I suppose then. Then I will back out of the promise, Stoic admitted sadly, his head lowered and shaking in shame as he heard the words that he dreaded to escape his son's mind. Hiccup suddenly panicked seeing his father so glum and upset at his words. Reaching out and grabbing his father's hand that still rested upon his knee, Hiccup met eyes with his father with a bright encouraging smile. I'll do it, Dad. I won't let you down. Let's go. Hiccup announced bravely, his father's face slowly brightening up. All right then, son. Let's go. Quickly moving around to the side of the car, and swinging the door open, Stoic helped his son out of the car and headed for the door to the grand house that still towered before them. Hiccup looked up at the tall, towering house before him, the walls reaching higher with every glance at them, reaching further into the sky as Hiccup looked over them in awe. Stoic grabbed his son's hand and helped him walk up to the large, wooden door that guarded the entrance into the house, its intricate and complex metal patterns upon the door catching Hiccup's eye. Reaching his heavy, muscular hand up to the door, Stoic knocked heavily upon it, creating a deafening sound as his hand made contact with the wooden surface. The loud sound echoed throughout the house and spooked Hiccup, who stood outside the door waiting for it to spring open. It soon opened to reveal a tall, muscular man, his body leaner than that of Hiccup's father, but his arms seemed just as muscular. This man was clearly someone who took care of themselves in the gym but didn't enjoy food as much as Stoic did if his rounder torso was anything to go by. Hiccup looked up to the man standing in the doorway, his neck craning back to look towards his face. The man was only a few inches taller than Stoic, but that didn't cause any kind of tension between the two of them as Stoic seemed a more intimidating presence than this man. Stoic. The man greeted loudly, his arms opening up to welcome Stoic into a friendly hug. Letting go of his son's hand, Stoic greeted his friend with a friendly, brotherly hug, patting his back as they entered each other's embrace. Ah, Thorold. It's good to see you. Stoic smiled brightly at his friend, stepping back slightly to push his son forward to enter the man's view. And this is my son, Hiccup. As Hiccup looked to the man to greet him, Hiccup noticed a small hint of amusement dusting his features. He knew what this man found amusing, it's what everyone found amusing about him, his name. The name that his mother had given him, not in spite or as an insult, just to describe what and who he is. A Hiccup. An unusual name, Hiccup. Thorold smiled, noticing Hiccup's watchful gaze as he bent down to greet the young child. Hiccup tried to smile, hiding the hurtful emotion that he was feeling, and offered an understanding nod. I know. My mother picked it. Hiccup announced happily. His name was his only memory of his mother, having never met her he treasured his name as though it were a picture frame. His mother called him that because he didn't want it used against him. You know how we call the runts of the litter, and the weaker-built people, Hiccups. Thorold nodded, standing up to meet Stoic's gaze as he explained his son's namesake. Well, my wife thought that if we named him Hiccup, then it will tell people that he knows what he is and that he will grow up to prove to people that a Hiccup is better than what most people think. Stoic ruffled his son's hair, he is stronger than everyone because he is a Hiccup. Hiccup looked up to his father with a smile, Stoic returned the bright, happy gaze before looking back up at Thorold. Thorold nodded, a warm, understanding expression dusting his features as he stepped into his house and opened the door wider. Well, please. Come in. Thorold welcomed the Haddocks into his house, the large open lobby stretching out in front of them. Closing the door behind them, Thorold stepped up beside Stoic and gestured him to follow as they made their way through a long, thoroughly decorated hallway. Every wall was covered in paintings, some of their relatives and old, deceased family members, others were average, lesser-known pieces to fill up the spaces left upon the wall. Soon they entered a large-looking living room, 3 sofas set up in a circle in front of the fireplace, a TV set up at the far end of the room, and a large bookshelf on the other side, directly next to the door. Hiccup scanned the room and saw a young, little girl playing on the floor in front of the fireplace, her mind completely involved in her task as she played with her dolls on the floor. My daughter's just inside playing with her dolls. I'm sure Hiccup wouldn't mind introducing himself to her whilst we chat, Stoic. He asked kindly, smiling down at Hiccup as he spoke. Stoic placed a loving hand on his son's shoulders and gestured over to where they could see a young, blonde girl playing by herself. The scene was rather lonely, and both Hiccup and his father knew that it would be rude not to say hello. Excited to see this young girl in such a large house, Hiccup rushed over to sit beside her, eager to make friends. The young girl looked up to see Hiccup sitting beside her, watching her movements carefully as he made himself comfortable on the floor next to her. "Who are you?" the girl asked politely, her head cocking to the side as she asked the question curiously. Hiccup smiled and looked at her with a bright and friendly expression. "I'm Hiccup, what's your name?" "I'm Astrid, do you want to play?" Chapter 2, Chapter 1. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. It had been 20 years since that day when Hiccup and Astrid had first met, however, it had also been the last day Hiccup and Astrid had met. After their meeting with one another, Thorold relocated to another part of town and lost contact with Stoic for a long time until 5 years ago. 5 years ago, Thorold returned to Berk and met up with Stoic in a desperate state and in need of a job. Recently, his company had filed for bankruptcy and Thorold was in dire need of a job and steady income to keep his family afloat. Stoic was more than happy to give his old friend a job and offered him a position as his chief operating officer. In this position, Thorold quickly worked his way up the ranks, and when Hiccup finished his education and took over as COO, Thorold was quickly promoted to CEO of the company and in charge of many important roles and functions of the company. However, all decisions had to be run by Stoic and his son, before they were approved and pushed forward. "What does that half-wit, dumb troll think he's doing?" Hiccup muttered to himself as he looked over Thorold's requests for investment ideas that had landed on his desk that morning. Hiccup was being taught by his father about the proper way to run a company, meaning that he had many of the chores that his father had, as well as the roles that his job title required him to do. However, occasionally Stoic would request that Hiccup join him in one of his many, boring board meetings and learn more about the detailed workings of his company. This led him up to reading a ridiculous request from Thorold on the agenda for the meeting that day. "Sir!" a petite voice called out from the door into his office. As Hiccup looked up, he met eyes with a bright-faced, black-haired woman peeking in through the gap in the door that she had made. Her face wasn't heavily made up, but it was obvious that she was wearing makeup. She had bold, thick eyeliner that accentuated her brown eyes and intricately braided hair that hung over her shoulder. Her eyes fluttered at him as she entered his office properly, standing with her hands rested upon her stomach and a bright, flirtatious smile spread over her features. This was Heather, Hiccup's assistant, and she was desperately and obviously in love with Hiccup. However, Hiccup had no interest in her whatsoever, as he never found her particularly attractive or pretty in any sense of those words. "What is it, Heather?" Hiccup asked coldly, his face not lighting up at her presence in his office. Heather had to momentarily steady herself from his cold stare and emotionless voice before she cleared her throat to speak again. Sir. You have that meeting today, with your father and the board," Heather reminded him. Hiccup let out an annoyed sigh at her words and collapsed back into his seat, allowing the chair to spin contemplatively as Hiccup looked up to the ceiling whilst letting out a bored sigh. "Okay, Heather. Is that now?" Hiccup asked, his eyes not daring to look her way as he dreaded her answer. "Yes, sir." Heather smiled devilishly, walking up towards Hiccup's desk in a sultry way. "Unless you had something else in mind," she flirted, leaning on Hiccup's desk in a seductive way. But it was a trick unlikely to work on Hiccup, who paid her advances no mind as he packed up his things. "I'll be going then, are you to join me?" he asked, wondering why Heather had gotten so close to his desk as he looked up from his work, with a briefcase in hand. Heather lowered her head and stood up straight, her hands resting in her lap as she stood in front of Hiccup's desk. "No, sir. I have other matters to attend to." With a heavy sigh and annoyed grunt, Hiccup rose from his seat and straightened his suit with a proud and sharp tug. He quickly grabbed the documents from his desk and gave them an extra glance over. The action made him roll his eyes before standing up straight. Looking over at Heather, he gave her a sharp and confident nod, earning a small smile and a shy gesture from her as he exited his office. Upon exiting the office, Hiccup looked down at his watch and noticed the time. 5 minutes. Taking a deep breath, Hiccup opened up the file in his hand and began glancing over it, making sure his theory was correct and he could make a valid argument against the request that Thorold was planning to make. As he rounded another corner in the office, something collided into his chest, spilling a hot, scaling liquid all over him, but luckily missing the important documents in his hand. A yelp and grunt from someone caused Hiccup's eyes to cast up from the papers and look down at the person who had bumped into him, as they had landed on the ground in front of him. Hiccup gave them a scathing look and gritted his teeth in frustration. His suit was ruined and now was stained in the brown liquid, which was presumably coffee based on its smell, and he had no time to rush to the bathroom and clean himself up. The woman who was sitting on the floor in front of him looked even more furious and upset than him, her eyes casting him a cold gaze that almost made him flinch in shock, but he remained composed as he gazed at her figure upon the floor. "Watch where you're going next time," Hiccup told the woman sternly, his gaze cold as he gave her figure a look up and down in disgust. "I wasn't the only one," she yelled, jumping up to her feet and standing in front of Hiccup with an accusing glare. "You should watch where you're going and apologize to me." Her eyes stared at him furiously, their ocean blue color momentarily distracting Hiccup for a moment as he found them oddly attractive, especially due to her heightened emotions at that moment. Hiccup also noted that she had beautiful blonde hair that was braided and resting over her shoulder but had the odd stray hair peeking out from the confines of the intricate ties. However, her words wounded his pride slightly and Hiccup straightened himself before leaning in closely, causing the woman to step back suddenly from his closeness. "Excuse me. But why should I apologize when I'm the one who got coffee spilled on by someone who wasn't looking where they were going? Probably daydreaming about flirting with your boss as you were taking him his cup of coffee. How is this my fault?" Hiccup asked sternly, his voice low and intimidating so as to not draw too much attention their way. However, due to Hiccup's status in the company, every employee within their vicinity was watching every moment of their encounter. "Well then, I apologize. I didn't realize that you had your head stuck so far up your own ass that you couldn't see where you were going. You're right, it was my fault. I do apologize." And with that, the woman gathered up the spilled coffee and disappeared down another corridor, leaving Hiccup alone with a coffee-stained suit. Did she just? Hiccup watched her figure disappear, and couldn't help the small chuckle escape his mouth as he replayed her words in his head. "Oh, coffee girl. You've got no idea who you just insulted, do you?" he muttered to himself before looking at his watch and rushing over to the meeting room where he was now running late. As he rushed into the meeting room, his father looked over him as though he had just been dragged through a hedge backwards, with his pants down. When Hiccup sat down beside him, Stoic leaned over to his son with a confused look and a stern, scolding voice. "What the hell have you been doing? Why do you look such a disgrace?" Stoic scolded, whispering to his son as the last few stragglers entered the meeting, also running late. "I'm sorry. Had an incident in the hallway with an assistant. She wasn't looking where she was going and bumped into me, spilling the coffee she had all over me," Hiccup explained as he grabbed a couple of tissues off the desk and attempted to pat his shirt dry and save what little whiteness was left on his shirt. Stoic chuckled under his breath, noticing the slight amusement and attraction beneath Hiccup's eye. "Was she pretty?" he asked, catching Hiccup off guard slightly. Hiccup paused his pat down and thought back for a moment, honestly checking his mind for her face, and smiled to himself. "Beautiful." He smiled but shook his head. "But, too self-righteous and rude for me, I think." "You never know," Stoic added, watching as the last member sat down. "Disagreement and hatred can make for the best attraction sometimes." Notes. New chapter every day. Chapter 3, Chapter 2. Chapter text. Astrid made her way back to her father's office with a frustrated huff to her step. Her footfalls echoed heavily throughout the corridor as she wandered her way over to her desk that sat just outside of her father's office. A few years ago, when Astrid was struggling to find her job and her overbearing father was forcing her to take up a position in business, Astrid was barely able to survive on her own. That was until her father's secretary suddenly decided to quit and relocate to a different island on the other side of the world, which should have been a warning to anyone who came next. Thorold offered Astrid the job to be his secretary until she could find another job, and that was the end of that. When Astrid arrived back at her seat, she clumsily collapsed into the cushioned chair that sat behind her desk and let out a huge sigh. The frustration she was feeling from what happened a few moments ago was still circling around her system and she wasn't fully ready to let it go yet. I mean, who does that guy think he is? Astrid said to herself in frustration, her anger and annoyance rising to the surface once more. He bumps into me and asks me to apologize. I mean, I guess it was partially my fault for not looking where I was going, but so was he. He should be apologizing to me as well. Astrid complained, her eyes dropping down to look at the work on her desk whilst she spoke. Her eyes landed upon her diary for that day and realized that her father was currently in a meeting with the board to pitch his ideas for future investments. Letting out a small sigh, Astrid relaxed in her seat and took out her phone. At least Dad won't be around for a few minutes, so I'll just wait for him to come back, Astrid muttered to herself before absorbing into her phone as the minutes ticked by quickly. Astrid. A booming voice called out in the corridor, causing Astrid to jump and throw her phone in the air and juggle it about in her hands to stop it from falling on the floor in surprise. What do you think you are doing on your phone? Astrid looked up to meet eyes with her father, his angry footsteps quickly approaching her desk. She eyed her sternly upon his approach. Quickly placing the phone on her desk in a discreet location, Astrid placed her hands in her lap and lowered her head in submission to her father. Slamming his fists down onto the table, causing a loud slam to echo outside of his office and Astrid to flinch from the volume. Sorry, father. It won't happen again. Astrid replied sheepishly, her head lowered apologetically to avoid her father's furious gaze. Letting out a sigh, calming his emotions quickly, Thorald's fists flattened out and he placed his palms calmly, but firmly, upon Astrid's desk. With a friendly smile plastering over his features, Astrid braved a look up to her father, who had a calmer expression upon his face as she looked at him. It's okay, Astrid. Just. Thorald seethed, hissing in a breath as he thought about how to phrase his next words. Just don't do it again, okay? He asked calmly, a small smile dusting across his lips. Astrid nodded slowly, lowering her head again from the intensity of her father's gaze. However, as he cleared his throat, he gained Astrid's attention and forced her head up to look in his direction. Now he started, his hands still placed upon her desk. Your mother and I have all been invited to a dinner with the chairman, Stoic. You remember the promise I made with him when you were little, don't you? Thorald asked with an intimidating smile on his face. Astrid gulped slightly as she met his gaze but slowly nodded. The arranged marriage? She asked, tilting her head slightly as she confirmed her answer. Yes. Father, Astrid complained, loosening her shoulders and rolling her eyes. I told you I didn't want to do that. Thorald hissed and his fists balled up again, causing him to readjust his hands that rested upon the desk. And I told you, that you don't have a choice. You're going to come to this dinner. You are going to agree to this marriage. And you are going to marry the chairman's son. Thorald ordered sternly, if you don't, I will take back everything that you have that I own. Your job. Mine. Your allowance. Mine. Your mother and I gone. Astrid's face slowly fell with every word that dripped out of her father's mouth like poison. You will become a broke, unemployed orphan, with no one to love you. Do you want that? He asked maniacally. No, father, Astrid replied weakly. Thorald smiled and slowly stood up straight, his arms resting by his side as he looked down upon his daughter. Good. Be there at Gothai's hut by 8 o'clock. Don't be late. Asterisk 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 asterisk. I wasn't unreasonable in denying the request, was I, father? Hiccup asked curiously, looking over to his father worriedly. He saw a hint of amusement in Stoic's eyes. His father chuckled at his words before giving him a gentle, loving pat on the back. No, you weren't, son. I was in two minds about denying it myself. Knowing that you were against it as well made me sure that it was the wrong investment. Stoic replied, withdrawing his hand away from his son's back and continuing to walk side by side with his son down the corridor. I always knew you had a knack for business. I'm not too sure about that. Hiccup muttered to himself, lowering his head and turning away from his father guiltily. Ah! Stoic suddenly exclaimed, stopping the two of them in an empty corridor alone. I almost forgot. We are having dinner with Thorald and his family at Gothai's hut at 8 tonight. Stoic smiled at his son warmly, but this only furthered the look of confusion spreading across Hiccup's face. "Why is this?" Hiccup asked curiously, his brow furrowed as he looked at his father. "Well, you remember that promise I made with Thorold when you were little?" Hiccup rolled his eyes. "The arranged marriage?" Stoic nodded with an eager smile. "Dad, you know what I think of this," Hiccup complained. "Come on, Hiccup. Don't be like that," Stoic announced, beginning to walk again and continuing down the corridor towards his office. "You never know, you might end up actually liking his daughter." Stoic wiggled his brow before turning to Hiccup now that they were standing outside his office. "All right. I'll go." Hiccup sighed, causing a smile to spread across his father's features. "Perfect. Tonight, Gothai's hut. 8 o'clock. Got it?" "Yep, got it, Dad." Asterisk 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 asterisk. Looking at himself in the mirror once more, Hiccup straightened his suit and adjusted his tie for the 1000th time as he focused on his reflection. He knew he didn't look stunning or handsome in a suit. In fact, he looked gangly and out of place as the suit barely fit his lean shape as he turned his nose up at the reflection of himself in the mirror. Over the years, Hiccup had grown some muscle, especially around his arms, but not enough to make a substantial difference to his appearance, and so he still looked like the lean, stick figure he was when he was a child. The only part of him that had truly grown with age, was his face. His auburn hair became messy and untamed with age, and the loose strands of hair gave him a rebellious, fresh look to himself, and it was the only part of his body he actually took care of. "Hiccup. You ready to go?" Stoic's booming voice called to him from down the stairs and immediately snapped Hiccup out of his trance. Giving himself another once-over in the mirror, Hiccup let out a nervous sigh and exited his room. "Coming, Dad," Hiccup called as he rushed out of his room and skipped down the stairs in a hurry. Landing at the bottom of the stairs and turning into the entrance hall of his house, he saw his father standing waiting for him by the door. Stoic was also in a suit, however, it was more fitting to his figure than Hiccup's was, and the sleeves were coming up a bit short on his arms due to his build, so he was constantly having to adjust them as he waited for his son. The entrance hall of their house wasn't huge, but it was bigger than most houses, having the space of a normal living room, but only being furnished with a coat rack / closet in the corner closest to the door, a small but ornate sofa, a shoe rack that sat next to the coat rack, and a long, worn, old rug that stretched from the front door all the way up to the stairs. Stoic looked up from his suit sleeve and gave his son a warm smile. Hiccup lowered his head and gave a half-hearted smile in return as he strode up beside his father. "You ready?" Stoic asked again, earning a small shrug from his son who was gathering his coat from the rack near the door. "As I'll ever be," Hiccup muttered as he pulled on his coat, "not like I have much of a choice either." His words were lost to the wind as he adjusted the coat to rest perfectly over his narrow shoulders and looked up to meet his father's eye. "Thank you for doing this, Hiccup. It means a lot that you are willing to try this. I know how much you've grown to hate the idea over time, but I really want this to work," Stoic explained, his hand reaching out to rest upon Hiccup's shoulder as he spoke. "I know your mother would too." Hiccup felt his heart grow heavy from the mention of his mother, a sense of guilt and despair passing over him as he thought back to his childhood, never having even known his mother. He hung his head down in shame as he realized that his secluded and lonely life could be seen as a disappointment to his mother, who only ever wanted him to be himself and not care about what others thought of him. But he did care. He cared a great deal. "Let's go," Hiccup managed to utter as he gestured towards the door, his eyes avoiding Stoic's gaze as he tried to swiftly exit the house. The journey to the restaurant was quiet and uncomfortable. Hiccup, not being much of a conversationalist, especially with his father, meant that Stoic's attempts to start a riveting conversation with his son were fruitless. Letting out a small sigh, Stoic soon gave up on talking to his son, and so the last 10 minutes of the journey were left in complete silence. Only the sound of the engine humming away filled the otherwise deafening silence between the father and son. Coming into the restaurant, Hiccup felt his nerves begin to settle in, a swarm of butterflies channeling through his stomach as his father and he were led to their table by the strict, diligent waitress, whose movements appeared to have a very martial step to them. Sitting down at the table, Hiccup had a straight view of the door, watching every person that filed into the restaurant and up to the waitress to show them to their seats. Soon, a group of 3 entered the restaurant. The family looked about the restaurant hurriedly and soon set eyes upon Hiccup and his father's table. Hiccup immediately recognized one of the 3 to be Thorold, and so he assumed that the 2 women trailing him were his wife and daughter. It appeared that the Hawfussons had arrived. As Thorold approached, the other 2 women trailing behind, Hiccup took the time to look at the young woman at the back of their little trio. She had golden hair that was let loose in the still air of the restaurant but had a small braid on the top of her head to keep any loose strands from falling in her face. She wore a magnificent baby blue dress that came down to just above her knee, showing off her curves, but covering up any insecure areas as she walked up to the table very self-consciously. Her arms were tightly hugging her figure and her eyes were focused upon the floor as she watched her feet try to balance themselves in the ill-fitting stilettos that she was forced to wear, presumably by her mother. The dress itself was sleeveless and covered up her chest up to the neck, but was fitting enough that one could guess the shape of her figure from the revealing way the fabric stuck to her skin. Hiccup thought she was beautiful, the most beautiful woman in the room. However, when they arrived at the table, and the young girl refocused her attention on their table, Hiccup met eyes with her. He recognized those enticing blue eyes and the soft cheekbones of the girl staring back up at him. As their eyes met, their gazes hardened and their breaths hitched. "Coffee girl?" Hiccup asked himself as his brain triggered the memory from earlier that day, his anger rising to the surface as he remembered her insulting words to him. "You!" Astrid muttered to herself as she recognized the man standing before him. When her father had told her about meeting her future husband, the son of the chairman, she had at least hoped that the guy would be somewhat self-aware of himself. Maybe even kind and selfless in the way that he would respect her decisions about this marriage. Her mother had forced her into a tightly fitting, uncomfortable dress and some pinching high heels to go with it. She wasn't prepared to be shown to her future husband like this, shown off like some prize pig, ready to be sold off to the meat market. Astrid knew she was worth more than that. However, as her eyes met Hiccup's, she knew that she wasn't likely to have any sort of freedom in this marriage and she was to become a trophy wife. Just like her mother. As their eyes met, Astrid felt her heart sink as she thought about the possible future again. "I have to marry this guy." Hiccup felt his heart beat faster as he looked at the beauty before him but noticed an angry but lost expression in her eyes. He knew that she was against this marriage as much as him, yet she seemed as though she had already gotten married to him. "I have to marry her." Chapter 4, Chapter 3. Chapter text. Hiccup and Astrid sat beside each other at the table, their eyes staring pointedly ahead, not daring to look at one another. Astrid looked over at her mother with a desperate, annoyed expression as she tried to escape from this awful situation she was thrust into. Hiccup wasn't enjoying the situation either and tried to distract himself by counting each new customer coming into the restaurant as they entered through the door. However, he was soon brought back to their table when his father's booming voice called out his name. "Hiccup. Are you okay?" Stoic asked in concern, looking at his son worriedly before Hiccup gave him a confident shake of his head. "I'm fine, Dad. It's okay." Hiccup replied, his hand raising to stop any further questions about it. Stoic shrugged and turned back to Thorold with a wide, excited grin. "It's been a long time since we got together like this, especially with the kids," Stoic announced, gesturing to the 2 awkward adults across the table from him. "I mean, they haven't seen each other for, it must be getting on for 20 years now." Hiccup and Astrid darted their eyes over to Stoic, a confused but shocked look covering their faces as they were made aware of this fact. Over the years, these 2 lost contact and forgot about each other's existence, quickly forgetting about their encounter together. "We met before?" Astrid asked in surprise, the words tumbling from her lips before she could think to speak. Her father gave her a scolding look that didn't go unnoticed by Hiccup. "Of course you have," Stoic repeated, "do you not remember? I guess it was a long time ago." Stoic rubbed his chin thoughtfully, forgetting how young the 2 kids were when they first met and so must have forgotten the meeting over time. "I mean, it was 20 years ago, wasn't it, Thorold?" Astrid's mother, Erica, piped up. "I mean, gods. Look at you, Hiccup. I must say you've grown up quite a lot since I last saw you." Erica complimented Hiccup, causing him to smile and bow his head from embarrassment at being the center of attention, even if it was for a few seconds. Much the same to you, Astrid. You've definitely grown up a lot over the years, if you don't mind my saying so. Stoic complimented, causing Astrid to blush slightly from his compliment and avoid her parents' gaze. Well then, Thorold spoke up, gaining everyone's attention on him. I think we know why we're here, let's not beat around the bush about it. Hiccup looked up awkwardly and nervously met eyes with Thorold across the table. What do you say about marrying my daughter? His question was very direct and it took Hiccup a few seconds of recoil to decipher what he had said. When Hiccup had regained his composure, rather quickly, he had a bright, friendly smile upon his face but a regretful look in his eye. I mean, I'm not too sure how comfortable I am getting married to a woman I don't know. Hiccup started, his gaze momentarily drifting over to his father, whose expression was beginning to drop and change into one of fury and disappointment. However, I suggest maybe Astrid and I get to know each other before the wedding and we'll. I'll do it, Astrid spoke up suddenly, her words instantly cutting off Hiccup's thoughts. We'll get married, and we'll take the time before the wedding to get to know each other, Astrid explained, her words directed at Hiccup as she turned her head to look up at him beside her. Hiccup gave her a confused look before he looked back over to his father, who had started beaming with pride from Astrid's words. Hiccup felt a sinking, foreshadowing feeling sink into his stomach as he saw a sickening smirk spread across Thorold's face momentarily. Looking back over to Astrid, Hiccup was unsure how to feel. But sucking in a brave breath, he turned back to his father and Astrid's parents. I guess, if Astrid's okay with this arrangement, then I am too, Hiccup announced firmly, his voice confident and serious as he faced the three stern eyes watching him. As the words left his mouth, all three figures began beaming with pride, and Erica clapped excitedly at the prospect of her daughter getting married. Stoic smiled at his son before looking over to Thorold and Erica with a knowing look. Our kids are growing up so fast, aren't they? Stoic said humorously, his words ringing hollow in Hiccup and Astrid's ears as the world seemed to fall away around them. Suddenly, Astrid's chair screeched backwards across the floor, the noise alerting everyone at the table to her movements. Placing her hands on the table for balance, she smiled politely at the four figures giving her quizzical looks. Excuse me, I am just heading to the bathroom, Astrid explained before dashing away in search of the toilets. Hiccup watched her go and quickly followed in pursuit after her, forgetting to alert their parents to his intentions. Hiccup chased Astrid towards the bathrooms, pursuing her all the way to the doorway, and when she actually entered he halted his movements. Instead, he opted to stand just outside of them and wait for her to reappear. A few minutes passed and Astrid reappeared from within the bathroom. Hiccup immediately intercepted her and made her pause in her place. She offered him a look of confusion whilst he just looked her up and down with a stoic expression. Did you follow me here, you creep? Astrid asked, a hint of offense evident in her tone. However, Hiccup just rolled his eyes and harshly grabbed hold of her hand. Astrid was about to protest and wrestle her arm free from his grip, yet his tight hold upon her arm gave her a comforting feeling as their skin touched. Suddenly, the urge to free herself from his grasp was no longer at the forefront of her mind and she became overwhelmed in the desire to feel more of his touch upon her skin. But his grip upon her arm didn't last long as Hiccup had finally dragged the two of them away from a public area and into a more secluded, quiet area of the restaurant. When Hiccup let go of Astrid's arm, she suddenly felt an unusual feeling of emptiness and her arm felt cold without his touch. But she continued to hold an annoyed, offended expression. What are you doing? Why did you drag me over here? She asked, her voice quiet but her tone shrill and annoyed at Hiccup's actions. Quiet down, I'm not even sure we're supposed to be in this part of the restaurant, but I needed somewhere quiet to talk to you. Hiccup explained, allowing Astrid's expression to soften and fall away. Why do you need to talk to me? Because I want to know why you are so willing to marry me, the man who bumped into you in the corridor and made you take all the blame for what happened whilst insulting your capabilities as an office worker in the process. Why on earth would you agree to marry this train wreck of a man before you? Hiccup replied hurriedly, his eyes portraying a curious look as he tried to gauge a reaction out of Astrid as she stared at him cluelessly. Well, She paused, thanks for summing that up. Her voice dropped in embarrassment as the words fell from his mouth. Really makes me realize I'm out of options. Hiccup let out a small sigh and looked at her sincerely. Look, I'm sorry, okay. I was a jerk earlier, and you were right. Astrid raised an eyebrow. I was also at fault and should have apologized as well. Hiccup lowered his head in apology, whilst Astrid smiled in triumph at the free apology she was being given. However, it still doesn't tell me why you would want to marry me. And so eagerly. Hiccup reiterated his words from earlier, the question and curiosity still eating away at him. Well, as I said, it's not like I have a lot of choice, Astrid replied, stroking her arm nervously as she spoke. What do you mean you don't have a choice? Hiccup asked worriedly, his brow dropping in concern as he searched her face for any sign of hurt or abuse. My father. She breathed out, he's forcing me to marry you. She admitted sadly, her gaze lowered as she felt ashamed by the fact. Why is he forcing you? Hiccup asked worriedly, his expression softened and searching Astrid's face for any cry for help. Astrid's brow suddenly furrowed at his words, and she had the sudden urge to push him away. It was a fear mechanism that she grew up with. Anyone that tries to get close to her or see her at her most vulnerable, she pushes them away. Looking up at him, Astrid brought her hand up to his face and slapped him across his left cheek, causing a stinging pain to shoot up to his face. Why do you care? You're only agreeing to marry because of your father as well. She pointed out harshly. You don't care for me at all, so don't act like you do. Look, I've had my fair share of breakups, and a lot of experience with men. So, let me tell you that I'm no easy girl. I've been cheated on, I've had false promises, I've had heartbreaks, I've been drugged and I've been raped. Astrid listed, her voice cracking as she spoke. So let me tell you, that if you were looking for any kind of relationship in this marriage, you are so very wrong. And if you've cooked up some half-baked fantasies in your head somewhere, thinking that we'll live happily ever after, forget it. There is no happily ever after when it comes to my life. That's just how it works for me. Astrid, don't be like that. I don't need your pity. I don't want any kind of kindness from you. I never wanted any of this, I never wanted to be so weak in front of someone like you. But that's just what I am now, because of you. Astrid huffed, her words breaking in her throat despite her need to sound strong and independent. When Astrid finished, she stormed away from Hiccup as quick as a flash, leaving Hiccup to gather up the information that she had just spat in his face. Astrid dashed back into the bathroom and let out the large, heavy tears that she had been attempting to hold in whilst talking to Hiccup. Look at you, Astrid said to her reflection, you really are weak. After a while, Astrid finally returned to the table after all of her tears had dried up and had been wiped away exhaustedly. Sitting down beside Hiccup, her body went stiff and her ears became red from embarrassment from their earlier conversation. She kept her gaze focused on the table ahead of her and tried to avoid eye contact with everyone at the table as the meals were served and the idle chatter continued. So, when do you think we should have the wedding? Stoic asked excitedly, his hands almost clapping in delight at the thought. Thorold scratched his chin in thought as he muttered aloud. Well, we're already in February, so perhaps we could go for an April wedding. I have a few contacts in the area who would be more than willing to help. Thorold explained with delight, and an unnerving smile spread across his face. Perfect. I love it. Stoic looked over at the two nervous-looking adults who were sitting on the other side of the table. What do you think? He asked happily, the smile never fading from his face. You know what we think, Dad. Whenever is right for you. Hiccup replied sadly, all drive and pride falling away from him as he wallowed in his own self-pity. Astrid noticed the sad tone of Hiccup's voice, and her heart momentarily ached for him. However, she was quick to stomp down that emotion and twinge of sympathy from deep within her. She wasn't allowed to let him tear down her walls. She was a strong, independent, brave woman. All right then son, April wedding it is. Chapter 5, Chapter 4. Chapter text. Astrid couldn't keep her mind at ease the next day, her head swirling with thoughts from the night before as she sat behind her desk, staring off into space. For some reason, the conversation she had with Hiccup had sent her mind off into some unknown direction and she couldn't find her way back. Why is this bothering me so much? Astrid wondered to herself, her words falling from her lips helplessly as she snapped herself out of her trance. Staring down at her desk, organizing the files that were strewn haphazardly across its surface, and opening up her laptop for the first time that day, Astrid set to work. The day passed by slowly, her mind constantly distracted by the events from last night, and her ears replaying the words she had heard from Hiccup. "Well, hello there, Miss Horferson." A strange, spine-tingling voice called out to Astrid from down the corridor. A man in his late 50s to earlier 60s was walking down the corridor towards him. He had a bright, unnerving smirk plastered across his features as he raised a hand in a small wave at Astrid. His hair was balding slightly, but what was left of it had a brown tint to it, with a few straggling hairs of grey scattered and clinging to his scalp like salt and pepper seasoning. His face had many wrinkles around his eyes and below his cheekbones, the skin slightly sagging off the bone there, and when he smiled, the skin seemed to stretch sickeningly over the bones and allow them to protrude out from his face like a dislocated bone. Astrid felt a small shiver run down her spine as he sent her a smirk and gave her a little wave, as though she were a child. Trying to act professional and not give any hint that she was creeped out by his gestures, Astrid gave him a warm, friendly smile and bowed her head at his entrance. "Hello there, Mr. Brighton." The man before her smiled brightly at her, his feet stopping dead before her desk and his body leaning down towards her. However, his gaze was not focused on her face, and Astrid noticed his eyes drifting elsewhere over her body as he leaned down towards her. My, you really have grown up into a beautiful young woman." He complimented her with a creepy smile still covering his features. Astrid tried to seem flattered by the compliment, instead, she felt sick and unnerved. "Thank you." Astrid looked over at her calendar and noted that he had a meeting with her father at that exact moment. "Do you want to head on in? I believe my father is waiting for you," Astrid explained, a professional look remaining on her face as she tried to not show any hint of reaction to his creepy compliments. "Oh, do I have to leave so soon? I was beginning to enjoy your company." As he said that, his hand reached out and caressed her arm that rested on the desk. The contact of his skin upon hers made Astrid flinch and withdraw her arms quickly and instinctively. "But I guess I'll head inside if I really have to." "Okay, just head on in." Astrid gestured to the door to Thorald's office, desperate for Mr. Brighton to head inside. Mr. Brighton smiled devilishly and slinked off into Thorald's office creepily. As he opened the door and alerted Thorald to his presence, Astrid heard a yell of welcome and surprise at his visit. But he was clearly glad to see the inappropriate and disgusting man entering his office. "You know," a voice called out to Astrid, making her raise her head, "you shouldn't let men talk to you like that." Astrid looked up and her eyes were met with a beautiful emerald pair of eyes that were staring at her as though she was the most precious gem in the world. Or at least they weren't looking at her as though she were their next meal. "Well, I didn't hear or see you doing anything to stop it." Astrid spat back, causing the auburn male to let out a soft chuckle at her words. "I only just entered the corridor when I heard what he said, and by the time I was in eyesight of you, he had already entered the office." Hiccup explained, "So, I'm sorry that I'm not the Flash, but I do try my best." Milady. Astrid felt her breath hitch at the little nickname that Hiccup had just given her. "Milady." Astrid muttered to herself, the word itself causing her heart to do backflips in her chest. "That is what I called you." Hiccup smiled, proud of the name that had made Astrid blush. "Are you from the 1920s? Astrid questioned, a small hint of amusement in her voice. "Do I look that old to you?" Hiccup smirked, joking along with her and earning a small chuckle from her. "Could have fooled me." Anyway, he starts again, halting there, flirting with the reason why he was there in the first place. "I actually came down here for a different reason than to berate you for something that creepy guy said." "What, you?" Hiccup shot her a serious look as Astrid smiled, knowing she had insulted him with her sarcastic reply. "Kidding." Astrid defended with a small frown on her face, unhappy that her joke didn't go down so well. Hiccup's scowl lifted before giving a small chuckle at her words. "I know, imperceptible." "Fooled you?" Hiccup joked, "But anyway, I was wondering whether you wanted to come and have a coffee with me." Hiccup asked hesitantly, suddenly feeling very nervous about asking the blonde girl in front of him. Astrid thought for a moment, pondering over the idea in her head. Until a small smile lit up her face and she gave Hiccup a scolding look, with a slight offense to her expression. "You came all this way to ask me to get you coffee?" she asked with a slight gasp in her voice. Hiccup chuckled through gritted teeth. That's bold when you know my track record in carrying coffee. Astrid joked, rolling her eyes at Hiccup's request. That's not what I asked you, milady. Astrid's heart did another jump in her chest. I mean, we go out together, to get coffee somewhere. Are you coming or not? He asked again, mildly irritated by her joke. Quickly recovering from the small jump of her heart when Hiccup called Astrid milady, Astrid gave Hiccup a reluctant nod and stood up from her chair. As she rose, she cast her eyes back over her shoulder and looked at the door into her father's office. My father will be in that meeting for a while. So I have time. Let's go. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. So, Astrid Hiccup began looking awkward as he sat at the table across from Astrid with a cup of coffee in a takeaway cup. Tell me about yourself. The two of them had made their way to a small, idyllic coffee house that rested across the street from the gigantic building they both worked in. Astrid had chosen a small two-seat table that sat by the window, allowing her to cast her eyes out of the window and observe the many people who walked on by. As Hiccup spoke up, Astrid returned her gaze over to the man opposite her and away from the window that allowed her to escape from this awkward, strange situation she found herself in. What do you want to know? She asked sheepishly, shrugging her shoulders nonchalantly as she replied to his question. Hiccup sighed and shook his head, the nervousness beginning to well up inside him and eat away at his confidence. Yet, a sudden idea hit him full force as he thought about a question he wanted to ask her. Okay, how about we play 20 questions? How about 10? Astrid countered, causing a small breath of amusement to escape Hiccup's lips. Okay, 10 questions it is. Well, you first. Astrid nodded in Hiccup's direction and allowed the man a few seconds of thinking time before allowing an annoyed expression to pass over her features. Slightly amused by her face, Hiccup allowed a small smile to spread across his face. Okay, then. First question, have you been in a relationship before? Raising an eyebrow as he spoke, Hiccup placed a theatrical hand upon his chin and stroked it gently. She paused. 3, I think. She replied coolly. Second question, if you weren't a secretary, what job would you want to have? Possibly an archery teacher, maybe in the Marines or the Navy. I dunno. I like fighting and I did a lot of boxing as a kid, so, something in that area I guess. Hiccup nodded in approval, surprised but attracted to the style of living that Astrid enjoyed. I guess I'd better not catch you on a bad day. Astrid stamped on Hiccup's foot, hard. Ow. Okay, touchy subject. He began rubbing his foot exaggeratedly. Next question, have you ever had your heart broken? Astrid avoided his gaze for a second before looking back at him. Yes, moving on. Okay, another touchy subject I guess. Fourth question, what scares you the most about your future? Hiccup asked, his brain fishing the question out of nowhere. Marrying you. The table fell silent for a moment and Hiccup felt his heart crash through the floor. So that's how she felt about this. Hiccup had barely thought about Astrid's feelings about this whole situation, only understanding that she wasn't doing it willingly by choice. But she was scared. That was news to Hiccup. Fifth question, why are you scared about marrying me? Astrid sighed as she fiddled about with the cup on the table, twisting it around and allowing the paper to scrape noisily against the wooden surface of the table. She was trying to find the correct words to say that wouldn't completely offend the man in front of her, because although she wasn't fond of Hiccup, she wasn't willing to completely destroy him. Astrid knew that Hiccup was understanding of this situation, but she didn't want to look weak or insult him about this whole thing. So, drawing in a big breath, Astrid looked back up at Hiccup. Because I'm afraid that this relationship will turn out like all my other relationships, and it's starting off that way, except this time I know it's not supposed to be real. Astrid admits solemnly, her head drooping slowly as she spoke. She felt somewhat ashamed admitting it to him, but it was only part of the reason why she was afraid of this marriage. The other reason she wasn't willing to admit yet. Wow, I don't really know what to say to that. Gods, I'm hitting all the targets today, 3 in a row. Hiccup joked cautiously. He rubbed his rather sweaty hands upon his thighs and looked at Astrid with a small smile. How about I make this my final question and then you can ask me some questions? Astrid nodded. Okay, final question, what would you say if we give this thing a year? Astrid looked at him confused, her brow furrowing in confusion and surprise. What do you mean? Hiccup smiled, crossing his arms. That's your first question. Astrid rolled her eyes. What I mean is, we agree to get married, actually get married and all. But instead, we just wait a year pretending to be in a married relationship, and then, after a year, we call it quits. We can tell everyone that we just didn't get on, or we just weren't that compatible, or we tried having kids and it just didn't work. You know, we can make up a better excuse when the time comes, but this can just be like a fake relationship contract you see in those rom-coms or bad fan fictions. Astrid looked confused throughout his explanation but then held up a stern finger at his last words. Her finger pointed harshly and sternly towards him. Now don't do those fan fictions down, some of them are really good. Hiccup chuckled at Astrid's words. I like the idea Astrid started, but what kind of relationship are we going to have instead, what are the boundaries? She asked curiously, thinking ahead further than Hiccup who looked slightly flustered from her question. Okay, that's your second question and one that I'm not too sure the answer to. I mean, I guess we could come up with some ground rules if you want. Hiccup suggested Astrid, giving him a warm, comfortable smile and a confident nod. Sounds good. So, is that a yes to my insane scheme? Astrid thought for a moment and nodded back in reply. Yes, as crazy as it sounds. I agree to your plan. Great. Hiccup smiled proudly. Now for your turn. I believe you have 3 questions left. Hey, I thought it was 10. Ah, that was until I changed it to 5 because you got uncomfortable. Fair is fair, I asked you 5 so you ask me 5. Hey. No, you asked me 6. Astrid argued back, pointing aggressively Hiccup's way as she remembered the questions Hiccup asked. Actually, I asked you 5, and my last question was more of a request. Hiccup countered, folding his arms proudly across his chest. Astrid rolled her eyes and let out a small groan, knowing that she couldn't argue it much further. Fine. I dunno. Do you believe in fate? Astrid asked nonchalantly, picking the first question that popped into her mind. Hiccup froze for a second, his momentary silence and stoic expression imperceptible to Astrid as she took another sip from her coffee. Hiccup looked closely at Astrid and observed the way she drank her coffee, how her eyes fluttered closed as she savored the flavor. Not before, but recently, yes. Yes, I do. Astrid looked at him in confusion and gave him an odd look before shaking it off and thinking back to her mind for another question. Do you believe in love at first sight? I guess I'll have to let you know when I decide. Hiccup winked, causing an unknown shiver to run through Astrid's body at the gesture. Shaking the feeling off, Astrid cast her mind to another question. Third question, what's your favorite pet? I guess. I'd love to own a dragon, a small black dragon. Astrid chuckled at Hiccup's answer, unsure whether he was serious or not. But realistically, I'd love to have a dog. They are my favorite kind of pet. I love their loyalty and how smart they are sometimes. Hiccup marveled, looking back in his memory at the few dogs he had met in his life. Me too. I think dogs are a good choice. Okay, fourth question, have you been in a relationship before? Hiccup acted wounded as the question exited Astrid's mouth, a shocked and hurt expression passing over his features. Ouch. Do I look that inexperienced to you? Hiccup shook his head and lowered his gaze away from her. Well, you are right, no. No, I haven't been in a relationship before. Okay, last question, have you had your first kiss yet? Astrid asked teasingly, knowing the answer to be no, but wanting to check anyway. Hiccup rolled his eyes and looked up at her with a smile. No, I haven't. Hiccup chuckled and cast a glance at his watch. Well, I think that concludes our little date. Let's get back to the office. Chapter 6, Chapter 5. Chapter text. So what's your plan now, Thorold? Mr. Brighton asked the man sitting in a large armchair in the middle of his office. Thorold's office was large but wasn't enormous enough to fit more than 5 people around the small table in the middle of the room. At one side of the room, directly to the left of the door, sat Thorold's desk where he had odd bits of papers and files strewn across the desk as though a hurricane had just passed through. To the right of the door, Thorold had set up 5 large, spacious armchairs. These armchairs all rested close together and were all sitting around an oval coffee table. It was there that Thorold sat with Mr. Brighton, discussing his current plan. "My plan." Thorold spoke up, his hand cradling his face in its palm as he was lost in thought. "Yes, I mean." Mr. Brighton cleared his throat carefully. "Your daughter is getting married to the chairman's son, Hiccup, isn't it? Are you really going to try and remove Stoic from the board before then?" he asked worriedly, leaning forward in his chair as he curiously questioned the thinking man adjacent to him. "Of course not, that would be a rather stupid move. Betray my future family before a major wedding." Thorold chuckled. "No, that wouldn't be right, and besides it would reveal my plan before I was truly ready." "No." Thorold stood up and made his way over to the large windowpane that lined one wall of his office. "I think I shall wait until after the wedding," he decided confidently. Mr. Brighton leaned back into his chair, thinking over Thorold's words whilst Mr. Horferson looked out the window thoughtfully. Neither man knew the correct course of action, because this was an extremely risky strategy. Their reasoning for removing Stoic from the board was shaky and unproven at best. Besides, Stoic's large company of trustees was strong and unrivaled. However, Thorold had been offering favors and benefits to those who would agree to remove Stoic from the board and those who were more resistant to the plan. He blackmailed them. Thorold wasn't proud of his actions, and neither did he think they were the right course of action for his goals. Yet, he could not see any other way of doing it, and so he was already committing these actions before he knew it. Nothing was moral about his repertoire and nothing was certain either, but it was something that his greedy, selfish mind was determined to do. Thorold turned back round to face Mr. Brighton, the sun hitting against his back like a fiery cannon and the heat of its rays burning through the black threads of his suit. He smiled at his friend, despite the light shadowing his face, and cleared his throat harshly. "Unless you have a different plan, Mr. Brighton. I would much like to hear it if you do," Thorold offered, but Mr. Brighton eagerly and fearfully shook his head rather quickly. "No, sir. You know what's best. I assure you, that whatever your plan is must be the one to follow." He spoke hurriedly, his words tripping over his tongue haphazardly as he spoke. Thorold smiled, amused by the fear he was striking into the man in his office. Good, good," he muttered to himself, slowly turning back around to look out the window. "Aren't you worried about an heir, Thorold?" Mr. Brighton spoke up, causing Thorold's shoulders to tense up. "I mean, wasn't the planned marriage between the two of them for the express purpose of creating an heir for the company, so that Stoic can hand his position down to his son?" Mr. Brighton spoke thoughtlessly, the words and questions in his mind spilling from his lips before he could truly think about them. "Yes, that was the reason for the marriage. But haven't I told you that the idea of handing down the company to your son is highly unethical and extreme disregard for proper management?" Thorold yelled in frustration, his emotions surfacing and boiling beneath his skin. Mr. Brighton whimpered in his seat, lowering his head in apology as Thorold turned back around and proceeded to approach the armchairs once again. Flinching at Thorold's movements, Mr. Brighton lowered his gaze and avoided looking at the approaching figure and stayed rigid in his seat. Besides, Thorold patted Mr. Brighton's arm in a friendly, jovial manner. That young man Hiccup wouldn't know what to do with a girl, even if she dropped her clothes in front of him. Thorold chuckled. "Let's just say he's not the most impressive man to look at, especially from a woman's point of view. He's weak and lean, as though he hasn't been fed properly since he was born. His hair is untamed and messy, as though he hasn't brushed out his fresh bedhead each morning." He joked, laughing at the appearance of the gangly Hiccup he had met the night before. "But what about Astrid? What if he's to her taste?" Mr. Brighton asked curiously, but he looked away from Thorold quickly when he was given a scornful look. "Don't worry, did you think I hadn't thought about that?" Thorold smiled as he thought back to a year ago, the last relationship she had. "I had manipulated/blackmailed her boyfriend to date her for a few weeks and then cheat on her purposefully. With her knowledge." Thorold let out a soft chuckle, leaning back into his seat comfortably. "I made sure that the guy actually had her fall head over heels for him, actually had her fall in love with him, and then he broke her heart. Mr. Brighton finished for him." Thorold nodded with a menacing smile. "Exactly. He pointed at the man sitting adjacent to him with a confirming finger. "And now, she will be so broken and distrusting around men that she will be unwilling to give herself to Hiccup. I doubt she will ever have feelings for a weakling like him. I mean, he was called Hiccup for a reason. All runts of the litter are called a hiccup." Thorold explained, the words spitting from his mouth like a snake spraying poison. Mr. Brighton had a whisper of disgust cross his features before he quickly wiped it away, afraid to show his reservations about Thorold's attitude to the man himself. Instead, he nodded along to Thorold's words and agreed to every pitch he put forward. In actuality, Thorold was blackmailing Mr. Brighton with evidence of his previous sexual harassment scandals, enough evidence that could either end him up in jail or just be fired from his job. Either eventuality didn't bode well for Mr. Brighton. But, Thorold covered his tracks well, managing to keep every evidence of his own corruption top secret so that Mr. Brighton couldn't blackmail him back. He was stuck. Astrid arrived back at the office, her takeaway coffee cup cradled in her hand with a tight grip, so that she didn't drop it. Looking at the door into her father's office, and at her watch, she realized he was still in his meeting with Mr. Brighton and a curious, confused expression crossed over her face. What are they possibly talking about that is taking so long? Astrid wondered, before shrugging her shoulders and wandering over to her desk. Whatever, it's not my place to criticize. Sitting down at her desk, Astrid looked at her coffee cup and saw a small message written on the side of her cup. The writing was small and barely readable due to the weird material of the coffee cup, but Astrid could just about make it out. What is this? Astrid asked herself as she squinted at the message, straining her eyes to read it. "Thank you for giving me a chance, and if you don't read this, then I hope you don't think too lowly of yourself in the future. You are a wonderful person, and don't let your father's words tell you otherwise." Astrid felt her heart warm by Hiccup's words. Such sweet, caring words with barely much meaning, but to Astrid, they meant the world. She couldn't help the smile that spread onto her lips as she read the message that Hiccup had left for her. However, she shook herself out of her trance and threw the empty coffee cup away into the trash, reminding herself of why she was doing all of this. "No." Astrid scolded herself. "Stop it. You are not supposed to like someone like him. Not again. We can't do this whole thing again when we know the end," she told herself as she looked at the scrunched up coffee cup in the trash. She couldn't let herself fall so easily. Not again. Chapter 7, Chapter 6. Chapter Text. Astrid looked at her reflection one last time, dusting off the invisible dust that had settled upon her dress as she stood there for a few minutes, staring at her own reflection. In her opinion, she wasn't sure the outfit suited her. Evening gowns or dresses weren't really her thing and she much preferred to cover up her flaws than flaunt them. It had been a few months since Stoic and Thorold had organized Hiccup and Astrid's wedding, forcing them into this unlikely circumstance as though it was always their destiny. Thorold had managed to obtain a wedding date for the middle of April, and as Astrid stood before her mirror, it was only a few days away. Now, Astrid was dressed up in her finest evening gown ready for the engagement party that her father and Stoic had insisted on having. Astrid wasn't sure about the whole event but knew that she didn't have much choice and therefore agreed anyway. As she looked at herself in the mirror, she admired the beautiful, bright red color of the dress, its satin look shining in the artificial light of her bedroom. The dress had no straps and was held up by her waist and her chest, lucky she was big enough to fit the dress without any gaps. The dress itself fit her perfectly enough that it almost seemed made for her, except she had never worn it before until that day. There was a long slit in the dress, running up all the way to the top of her thigh and exposing most of her leg. Yet the dress didn't reach the floor, instead, it stopped about a centimeter or so before the floor so that it didn't trail, or Astrid could trip. "You look beautiful, darling." Astrid's mother, Erica, complimented her as she entered the room, peeking her head around the door as she looked inside. Astrid turned around to look at her mother, a small blush creeping onto her cheeks as she took in her mother's compliment. Erica walked up to her daughter with a proud smile, until she reached Astrid and took a closer look at her face. "Why aren't you wearing makeup?" Astrid gulped, she didn't know the answer to that one. The truth was that she didn't like makeup all that much. She would apply a small amount around her eyes or on her lips if she felt like it was needed. But for some reason, Astrid didn't feel like she wanted to impress anyone at the party that evening. There was no desire to look good. Instead, Astrid just wished to disappear into the crowd and fade into the darkness. But that wasn't going to happen. Not as one of the guests of honor. "Mother, I don't want to wear makeup," Astrid complained, but her mother wouldn't take no for an answer. Suddenly, Astrid found herself being dragged into her n-suit and her mostly empty makeup bag thrust onto the countertop. Not missing the small scoff of disappointment from her mother, Astrid allowed Erika to cake as much of her face as she could in makeup, covering up every blemish upon her face so that she looked like a perfect Barbie doll. And Astrid didn't like it. "Ah, Mom," Astrid complained, throwing a small hissy fit at her appearance in the mirror. To Astrid, there was too much makeup on her face, making it extremely obvious that she was wearing makeup. Erika slapped her daughter's arm lightly, but the threat was still evident. "Don't you dare complain. I will not allow my daughter to step out of this house without looking perfect. Do you understand?" Her question was stern and harsh. Astrid lowered her head and gave a small nod in understanding before listening to the fading footsteps of her mother exiting the bathroom. Astrid looked back into the mirror and looked at her face, a face that she no longer recognized. "Who are you? What have you become?" she asked herself sadly, wiping away the concealer on her cheeks and forehead and just leaving her lips and eyes heavily made up. To Astrid, that made no difference to her appearance whatsoever, and in fact, made her look more natural than Erika's work of art ever did. However, as Astrid made her way downstairs, her mother was glaring at her as though she had just murdered her mother. Yet, Astrid was quickly saved by another voice who appeared from behind Erika and looked up at Astrid coming down the stairs. "Oh, Astrid. Don't you look beautiful, my darling daughter? Every man is going to fall to their knees at your presence, my dear." He complimented her warmly, causing a small blush and shy smile to spread onto Astrid's face. Thorold didn't compliment her often, but when he did Astrid always appreciated it. "Shall we go?" Astrid suggested, and Thorold nodded. Grabbing Erika's arm, the family headed out of the house and towards the car that was waiting for them at the end of the driveway. Asterisk 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 asterisk. "It's okay, son, they'll be here in a minute," Stoic said calmly as he watched his son check his watch for the millionth time. To say that Hiccup was nervous would be an understatement. Nervous wasn't even half of it. He was terrified, the fear was beginning to churn his stomach and he could barely think straight. Hiccup's mind felt like it was on fire, every scenario playing in his mind as though he was living it, he couldn't stop it. It felt like he was going insane. The only thing that was keeping Hiccup's mind from going insane in those moments was checking the time. "I know, I just wanted to know whether they were late. You know I don't like being late," Hiccup explained, his excuse barely believable but it made Stoic chuckle. Wrapping a comforting arm around Hiccup's shoulder, Stoic tugged his son closer into a warm, fatherly hug. "Everything will be fine, son. You'll see," Stoic said softly, his words comforting Hiccup more than he had expected when he heard them. But suddenly, Hiccup felt all the fear about the night fade away and he felt more at ease. "In fact, I think that's them now." Hiccup looked up from his watch and saw a black sedan pulling up the driveway. The engagement party was being held at a large manor house, the driveway having a large fountain in the middle that many guests parked their cars around. The front gates to the large manor could be seen from the front steps of the manor, the large, heavy, wooden doors to the house being only a few steps behind Hiccup as he stood overlooking the fountain and gravel driveway around it. The drive up to the fountain and front of the manor was lined with trees all along the side of the road up to the fountain, the leaves providing perfect shelter from the rain and sun. At night, the trees shadowed the drive enough that the naked eye could barely peer through the darkness ahead. However, both Hiccup and Stoic had excellent eyesight and spotted the black sedan pulling in through the gates perfectly. As the car pulled up outside the house, parked just below the steps where Hiccup and Stoic were standing waiting for the Horfusons, a figure appeared from within the car. Rushing to the side nearest the steps, the chauffeur opened the car door and revealed two beautiful women inside. Thorold revealed himself from the passenger side door and smiled up at Stoic as he closed the door behind him. Hiccup's eyes focused on the final figure to leave the car and he felt his heart stop as he laid his eyes upon her figure. Astrid was dressed in a magnificent red dress that hugged her curves perfectly, as though the dress had been made for her. She had light makeup on her face, which Hiccup appreciated, and she had small height heels that only increased her height by an inch or less, so she was still shorter than Hiccup. But Hiccup had to control his mouth from hanging open and drooling at the beautiful sight of Astrid that night. She looked like a goddess. Wow! Hiccup breathed without much thought, causing a small smile and breath of amusement to erupt onto Stoic's face before he stepped forward to greet the Hofersons. "Thorold, Erica. Glad you could make it." Stoic turned to look at Astrid, who had locked eyes with Hiccup a few steps above them. "And Astrid, one of our guests of honor. How are you?" he asked politely, giving her a firm handshake. Astrid smiled at Stoic's politeness, much preferring to shake his hand than hug each other. After all, they weren't too familiar with each other yet. Hiccup smiled as Astrid looked up at Stoic with an appreciative smile, but he tried to subdue his love-struck expression. "Thank you for having me." She bowed her head slightly as they shook hands. Astrid quickly returned her gaze to Hiccup and had to quickly look away as she felt a small blush creep onto her cheeks. "Shall we head inside?" Thorold suggested and gestured for them all to head inside. Astrid began to make her way up the stairs, but as she got to the step that Hiccup was on, she stumbled slightly as her heels missed the step. Hiccup quickly leapt forward and grabbed her arm, steadying her so that she wouldn't fall. As he grabbed her, their gazes locked and Astrid felt another blush appear on her cheeks, but Hiccup just stared into her ocean blue eyes. "Thank you," Astrid muttered as she regained her balance, but kept her hand on Hiccup's arm as they made their way up the stairs together, trailing behind their parents. "You're welcome," Hiccup replied, clearing his throat nervously. "By the way, you look beautiful." Astrid blushed even more at his compliment, almost feeling as though she was about to explode from his kind words. Men's words to her, especially compliments, never usually bother her. But Hiccup's. They were making Astrid's heart do flips inside her chest and beat loud enough that he could probably hear it. Refusing to speak and show how much his compliment affected her, Astrid strode into the manor alongside Hiccup, her hand still placed upon his arm as they made their way inside. The hall that they walked into was a grand, large hall stretching high enough to reach 3 stories without floors to separate them. Astrid had to crane her neck back to see the roof as she walked in, it towering overhead as high as the night sky, and it was then that she thought she wasn't fancy enough for this party. But Hiccup placed a warm hand over hers and comforted her with his contact upon her skin. He looked over to her with a smile and leaned over to her. "Remember, we have to pretend as though this is somewhat real," Hiccup reminded her, causing Astrid's heart to plummet. For a moment, she had forgotten that this was all a ruse and that she wasn't actually marrying Hiccup for real. She was marrying him, but not for love. They had agreed to only stay married for a year before breaking things off. But for one fleeting moment, as they were entering that party, Astrid wanted it to be real. "Could I have everyone's attention?" A loud booming voice, that Hiccup recognized as his father's, echoed around the grand hall and instantly gained everyone's attention. Stoic had found himself on the stage overlooking the party and gestured for Hiccup and Astrid to come closer. Reluctantly, the couple headed over to the stage and stood in front of it awaiting Stoic's words. "Now, I know that you have all been waiting a long time for this. Trust me, so have I, and now I can finally present to you the lovely engaged couple that are to be wed soon. I give you Hiccup Haddock and Astrid Hoferson," Stoic announced, which caused the entire hall to erupt into loud, proud applause. Astrid wanted to melt away, she didn't like all this attention. But she knew that she'd have to weather it for the time being. Both she and Hiccup were going to be hot topics in the business world for some time, especially up until the wedding, and Astrid wasn't sure how to feel about that. Hiccup squeezed her hand again and brought Astrid back to reality as she waved politely and smiled at the applauding audience surrounding them. "Now, let's get this party going," Stoic announced, halting the applause and allowing the crowd to continue with the party. Soon after the short speech, many people came over to congratulate and compliment the young couple. Some wanted to have more information about them, like their origin story, but both managed to slip away and head to the bar before they could be bombarded any further. "Thank gods we got out of that mess quickly," Astrid sighed as she leaned onto the bar and ordered herself a drink. She felt like she needed one after that onslaught of people. "I know," Hiccup replied, ordering a drink for himself also. "I just hope that all of this publicity will die down after our wedding and we can continue on with our normal lives." He sighed forcefully, a sense of stress and difficulty with the action caused Astrid to furrow her brow. Taking a small sip from her drink, she leaned forward and looked carefully over Hiccup's face. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, just not sure I can handle all of this attention, you know." Astrid nodded in reply. She had been popular in school, especially with the boys, however, she wasn't always a lover of attention. Astrid would have much preferred to be left alone and allowed to spend her time doing what she loved to do. But due to her high status and overbearing father, that wasn't always possible. "Hiccup." A loud, obnoxious voice called out to Hiccup, causing his attention to turn away from Hiccup and look in its general direction. "Jack. What are you doing here?" Hiccup asked the white-haired man that approached them. The man, Jack as Hiccup had called him, was very similar in build to Hiccup. Both men were fairly lean and didn't have a lot of muscle to them, unlike many men that lived on Berk. Jack had a dazzling white smile with hair to match, and it seemed as though he and Hiccup were quite good friends. "What do you think I'm doing here?" "I'm here for your engagement party." Jack gave Hiccup a mild slap on the back in a very friendly way. "By the way, you never told me you were engaged. How long has this been going on?" Jack asked curiously, a hint of amusement to his tone as he continued to smile with them. Not long I guess." Hiccup replied before Jack gave him a sudden tug. "Oh man, you've got to come and talk to the guys. They'll definitely be wanting all the details. You're cool with that, right Astrid?" Jack asked joyously, his smile stunning her for a moment. But before she could reply or disagree, Jack was already dragging Hiccup away from her and into the crowd. A few minutes passed, and Astrid was beginning to get nervous. She didn't need Hiccup to be with her, but there were only so many people she could lie to and turn away before it began to get to her. Instead of standing around, she wanted someone to talk to, and she didn't want it to be Hiccup, but he was the only person she actually knew at that party. Moving away from the bar, Astrid began to navigate her way through the crowd. She wanted to find Hiccup and maybe escape from this hellhole she was finding herself in. She didn't want to be there, and she assumed that Hiccup didn't either. But what she had stumbled upon after escaping from the crowd made her stop in her tracks. Who the hell was Hiccup talking to so closely? Chapter 8, Chapter 7. Chapter text. Looking down into the entrance hall of the manor, where the party cut off and left the hall empty, Astrid looked out to see her fiancé flirting with a black-haired female. Something within her was uncomfortable and angered by this interaction. However, Astrid couldn't figure out why their closeness bothered her. "Hiccup." Astrid whispered out, his name falling from her lips without her realizing. Yet, the two were in such deep conversation and close proximity that her voice was drowned out by their close breaths. Hiccup tried to keep himself as far away from the girl as possible, but when he was pinned against the wall by her, he didn't have much of a choice but let her get close. She placed her hand upon his arm and stroked it gently, a hint of sexual tension in her fingers as they danced up his skin. However, Hiccup was not affected by any movement she made towards him, and instead, he just prayed that she'd go away. But from Astrid's perspective, Hiccup was feeling the opposite. From where she was standing, Hiccup was keeping the girl close, wanting their intimacy, and the underlying tension between them was growing thicker by the second. Anyone could feel it. Astrid felt sick to her stomach when she watched the girl's hand touch Hiccup's arm and dance it up to his neck, feeling his hot skin beneath her fingers. Astrid couldn't take any more. Turning away, she stormed off and into the crowd, wanting to get away from the scene as quickly as possible. For some reason, the fact that Hiccup had abandoned her to go and talk to another girl bothered her. Was she not good enough? "Heather, stop this," Hiccup whispered, pushing his flirtatious secretary off of him a bit more, but she still managed to keep herself attached to him despite his protestations. "It's not right, I'm getting married and I'm your boss," Hiccup continued to protest. Heather leaned in closer, pushing past the barriers that Hiccup had been attempting to put up, believing her looks and words were enough to make him sway. Yet, she underestimated Hiccup's loyalty and willpower. "Yeah, but it's not a real marriage. You're only arranged, you're not actually in love with her, are you?" she asked, although the question was rhetorical. Hiccup felt the need to reply. As she asked the question, Hiccup felt a small pang in his heart and a new question filled his head. Did he love her? Hiccup turned his head away from Heather and looked over to the party in the main grand hall. As he looked, he managed to make out a small head of familiar blonde hair turning away from them and walking back into the crowd. A small part of him wanted to chase after her, but another part of him decided that he didn't care. He didn't love her like that. No, I guess not. Hiccup replied sadly, a reluctant tone to his voice. Heather smiled and wrapped her arms around Hiccup's neck whilst he was momentarily distracted. Right, so we haven't got a problem here then, Heather announced before she began to throw herself at Hiccup. Just as Heather leaned forward, her movements quick and harsh, Hiccup pushed her away forcefully. He knew what she was about to do, and he wasn't just about to give it away. That was something he would save for the girl he loved. But at the moment, the girl he loved wasn't Heather. Scowling harshly her way, watching as Heather struggled to regain her balance and recover from the sudden movement, Hiccup stood up away from the wall and walked closer to Heather, who was now standing a few feet away from him. Well, it is a problem for me, and I sure do hope you are drunk right now, Heather. He scolded, his voice bared through gritted teeth. Because if not, I could get you fired for sexual harassment, and trust me, that's not a good thing to put as one of your references. Trust me, kissing me is not worth being fired. Hiccup warned, causing Heather's eyes to widen momentarily before she held a hand to her head, clearly acting dizzy from the alcohol. You're right, sir, I'm sorry. I clearly had too much to drink. Heather replied, holding her head dramatically as she swayed lightly. Hiccup rolled his eyes and put his hands in his pockets. I trust you can get a taxi. If you are able to pretend to be wasted, then I am sure you are sober enough to call a taxi and take yourself home. Hiccup said stoically, looking her up and down with a disgusted face before he turned his back on her and made her way into the crowd. Pushing his way through the crowd, Hiccup looked desperately for any sign of Astrid. He knew what she was wearing and her hairstyle that night, but finding her amongst this crowd was like looking for a needle in a haystack. However, Hiccup tried to make his way back to the bar, remembering that that was the last place he had left her. Breaking through the crowd and seeing the bar before him, Hiccup's eyes landed upon a sight that made his blood boil. His eyes set upon two people sitting in front of the bar, one looking rather uncomfortable, the other standing rather too close for Hiccup's liking. Watching the interaction, Hiccup felt his fists clench up and his face harden as his gaze fell upon the couple. I told you to leave me alone. I'm getting married. Come on, Astrid. Your fiancé isn't around, and we both know that this whole thing isn't real. A drunk co-worker had flung themselves at Astrid, her face contorting into one of disgust before she quickly dropped it back to one of concern. The guy was too drunk to stand, his words slurring as he tried to appeal to the young woman in front of him, but this only made Astrid mildly amused. Maybe to you, besides if I go with you the whole act will be broken. Another time maybe. Astrid replied, trying to keep the hostilities to a minimum. Besides, Astrid wasn't about to turn away someone willing to talk to her, the whole interaction was distracting her from the sight she had witnessed a few minutes ago. You're right, but perhaps if we went somewhere quiet. Suddenly the man leaned forward and placed an inappropriate hand upon her thigh, his fingers rather close to her intimate area, and Astrid felt her blood run cold in a matter of seconds. She was no longer sure she wanted to keep this man around as he leaned in closer, his alcohol breath hitting Astrid like a freight train, causing her to splutter and cough from its strength. I don't think that would be a good idea, Astrid explained, trying to pry the man's hand off of her thigh, but it was stuck tight. A flash of black, seemingly out of nowhere, suddenly appeared across Astrid's vision momentarily as she flinched backwards. When the black smear of color withdrew from her vision, Astrid was met with the sight of the man in front of her tumbling to the floor, holding his cheek with a garbled groan of pain. Astrid's brow furrowed until she looked over to the side where the black had originated. There, standing before her with a furious expression on his face, was Hiccup. His fist was clenched and his knuckles red from the impact, but his jaw was locked tight as he tried to subdue the anger that had overtaken him and caused him to punch the man in the face. Hiccup. What the? Astrid trailed off as Hiccup harshly grabbed her hand and tugged her off of the bar stool and away with him. Did you just punch him? Come on, I'm taking you home. He announced quietly, his words barely audible to Astrid as he dragged her through the crowd and out of the manor. When they emerged from within the manor and greeted the night air, Astrid pulled her hand out of Hiccup's harshly, her skin scraping against Hiccup's nails which had dug into her hand for extra grip. Astrid stormed past Hiccup and began making her way down the steps to the gravel driveway. "What the hell did you do that for? I can handle myself, you know." Astrid huffed, scowling furiously as she ripped her hand away from Hiccup's. Letting out a frustrated sigh, Hiccup squeezed his eyes shut and held his nose, attempting to calm himself down and not yell at Astrid. He watched her storm down the steps, her feet unbalanced and inelegant in her heels as she attempted to make her way down the stairs. "I know, and I'm sure you can. I just didn't like how he was touching you," Hiccup explained calmly, reaching out to stop Astrid from running away from him. But her back was turned away from him. "I couldn't control myself." "Oh, but I'm supposed to be okay with another girl touching you." Astrid turned around as her words caused Hiccup to stop dead in his tracks, his eyes wide and his jaw slack. "It would be considered rude if I interrupted, wouldn't it?" Astrid mocked, pointing her finger into Hiccup's chest as she enunciated her point. "I have to control myself, don't I? You saw that." Hiccup breathed, but Astrid scoffed at his surprising words. "What? Was I not meant to?" she asked in offense and a mocking tone. It was clear to anyone walking by that Astrid was pissed. In fact, she was so furious and livid that steam was beginning to erupt from her ears like she was a kettle ready for pouring. Astrid Hiccup breathed, "It's not what you think." "Oh, really? You know, it's never what I think." "But how do you know what I'm thinking?" There was a small pause. "Didn't think so." Astrid huffed and turned back around. "Look, I just want to be alone now, so I'll be going home and Astrid screamed out in pain, quickly bending down to grab her ankle which had twisted slightly from her heels. Hiccup quickly dashed over and looked over her ankle carefully, a concerned look etched across his face. "Are you okay? Does it hurt?" Hiccup asked worriedly. Crouching down beside her, Hiccup grabbed Astrid's ankle gently, cradling the joint in his palm like delicate pottery. Looking over her injury, he didn't feel Astrid's gaze on him, admiring his features as they worried over her injured foot. His warm hand upon her skin tingled her leg and heart as he peered at her ankle, inspecting it over and over again. "Can you walk on it?" Hiccup asked, snapping Astrid out of her trance. Standing up quickly, seething through some of the pain she felt in her ankle, Astrid stood up proudly. Her face momentarily contorted into one of pain, but quickly returned to normal as she stood before Hiccup with a brave face. "I'll be fine. I don't need you to take me home. I'm a big girl." As she tried to take a step forward, she almost collapsed again. However, as she began to fall, Hiccup rushed to her side and kept her steady. "Yeah, a big girl with a twisted ankle," Hiccup pointed out with a soft chuckle. "Come on, stop being so stubborn and let me take you home," Hiccup pleaded, keeping a firm grip on her arm to keep her steady. With a heavy sigh, Astrid nodded and allowed Hiccup to lead her down the steps. The going was slow, but Hiccup was patient and wouldn't let Astrid rush as she slowly and carefully made her way down the stairs in her heels. Hiccup offered to carry her to his car, but Astrid blatantly refused and so painfully trudged her way across the gravel over to Hiccup's car. Opening the passenger door for her, Hiccup helped Astrid in carefully, making sure not to cause her any more pain. As she sat down in the car, making herself comfortable on the seat, Hiccup closed the door and quickly made his way round to his door on the other side. Sliding in and closing the door behind him, Hiccup pulled his seatbelt on and started the engine. Looking over to Astrid, he saw her struggling with the seatbelt and gave a small smile. However, before he could help her, the seatbelt sprung free and allowed Astrid to belt it up. "You good?" Hiccup asked as he pulled the car out of the park and looked over at her with a small smile. Astrid nodded, keeping a still emotionless face as she turned away from him and focused on the outside world. "Just drive," Hiccup Astrid said with a sigh of frustration. Hiccup chuckled at her words but drove on nonetheless and took them out of the manor. The drive was quiet, neither one of them willing to say anything or start a conversation. Astrid continued to look out the window and ignored Hiccup's attempts to gain her attention, occasionally looking her way to check on her. With a heavy sigh, and a drop of his head when they came to a stop at another stoplight, Hiccup turned to Astrid with a stern face. "What is your problem?" Hiccup asked sternly, his brow furrowed and his voice rigid. Astrid looked over her shoulder at him and gave him a look of confusion and surprise at his sudden tone. Why do you care? Because, Astrid, as much as you hate me to admit it, I am going to be your husband. In fact, I am currently your fiancé. So, I have to care about you enough to make sure you aren't uncomfortable with me. Hiccup seethed, his voice growing in volume as he vented his frustration out on her. However, the loud honk of a car horn behind him made his focus return to the road as he noticed the light had turned green and he drove off again. His hands clutched the steering wheel tightly and the action made Astrid gulp. Well, stop caring. I don't want you to care, because then I will have to care about you too. Astrid muttered, causing Hiccup to let out a scoff of anger. You know what, I'm going to be so glad when this whole thing is over and I can be rid of you. I wouldn't want to marry a selfish brat anyway. Hiccup replied coldly, her previous words stinging him enough to want revenge. Astrid looked over at him slightly hurt but decided not to continue the fight. It would be foolish to continue this attack. So, when Hiccup pulled up outside her house, Astrid quickly left the car without a sorry or goodbye. Chapter 9, Chapter 8. Chapter text. This was it. The day had finally come. Astrid and Hiccup were nervous as hell. A knock sounded from the door and Astrid turned her head towards it. She was currently standing on a pedestal in front of a mirror, looking at her reflection in this beautiful wedding dress her mother had picked out. Astrid wasn't too sure about the fit herself, but it didn't look too revealing or too loose upon her figure, so she supposed it would have to do. Astrid watched as the big wooden door into her dressing room creaked open, and a familiar face peeked through the gap. As she peered inside, Astrid smiled upon her arrival and stepped down from the pedestal and made her way over to them with her arms out. Rough. Astrid squealed, her arms flinging around this woman's figure in a bear hug. Astrid and Rachel, Rough Nut was her nickname, had been best friends since they were young. However, they hadn't seen much of each other after Astrid's family relocated, but they had gotten back in touch a few years ago when Astrid first started working for her father. After hugging for a few moments, Astrid pulled away and looked over Rough Nut's figure, taking in the sight of her boyish friend in a slim-fitting dress. Wow, never thought I'd see you in one of these. Astrid joked as she took a step back to look at her friend. Rough blushed and gave Astrid a light punch in her shoulder. Shut up, she turned away slightly, and I never thought I'd see you getting married. I know about your track record after all. Rough teased, but this caused Astrid's face to fall. Thanks for that, Rough. Astrid replied solemnly, but her friend just chuckled and gave her another friendly nudge. Come on, you know I was only joking. Besides, those guys were jerks. You deserve so much better than them. I guess that's why you chose Hiccup, right? Rough asked, smiling brightly at her friend. He's incredibly sweet, charming, and handsome too. Yeah, whatever. Astrid rolled her eyes. Suddenly her eye caught something in her friend's hand, slightly hidden behind her back. Hey, what's that you got there? Astrid asked, reaching out for the box in Rachel's hand. Oh, this. Rachel held it up and gestured to it with a small shake, before placing it into Astrid's hands. It's from Hiccup. He said it was a little gift, to remember our promise, I think he said. Rough explained with a shrug. Astrid fumbled around with the box in her hand and quickly opened it up. As she opened it, her eyes set upon a delicate, beautifully crafted ring. It had small, silver-knotted hearts decorating it, making up its circular design. Each knot looked intricately designed and beautifully crafted, and it made Astrid wonder what kind of genius created such a work of art. It's beautiful, Astrid breathed, all words escaping her as she looked upon the ring's beauty. Rachel shrugged and gave her a small pat on the shoulder before beginning to retreat from the room and out of the door. Well, he wanted to see you wear it up there. You got 5 minutes, remember. Don't be late. The door closed, and Astrid was finally left alone in the room admiring the small promise ring now delicately placed upon her finger. Her gaze fixed upon the silver metal that wrapped around her ring finger tightly, and a small smile spread onto her face. I guess this is it, the prologue is over. Time to start a new chapter. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Now you may kiss the bride. Hiccup froze, his palms became sweaty from anxiety as his gaze locked onto Astrid's, momentarily drifting down to her lips. He stared at her, not making a single move towards her, their hands still connected after putting on the rings and their bodies facing one another. Yet, neither one of them moved after the priest's words. Everyone held their breath as they waited for the action to seal their marriage together, yet there was a pause after the priest's words. Nobody moved as the whole wedding hall went deathly silent as the newly married couple gazed at each other. However, with a quick roll of her eyes and a small tut of her tongue, Astrid slipped her hands out of Hiccup's and grabbed onto his suit collar. With a strong tug and tightly shut eyes, Astrid placed her lips rather forcefully onto Hiccup's. Yet, their connection was only short and constituted as more of a peck than a kiss, but it was enough to draw a cheer and applause from the onlooking crowd that was watching them. As Astrid withdrew her hands from Hiccup's collar and returned them to her side, she leaned in closer to him whilst avoiding his gaze. "It was just a peck, don't overthink it too much. You still haven't had your first kiss yet, so remember to use it wisely." Astrid whispered, her words only audible to Hiccup as he shook himself out of his trance and took Astrid's hand to loop through his arm. Walking down the aisle together, Hiccup allowed a beaming smile to spread onto his face. "I know, I never overthink things. You must be talking about yourself." Hiccup joked, earning a small poke in his side from Astrid as they walked out of the wedding hall together. Once out of the wedding hall, both Hiccup and Astrid were taken away by a frantic-looking photographer who dragged them into a nearby room and started taking photos of them together. Most of the photos taken showed Hiccup and Astrid trying to look in love, and like they at least cared for one another. However, this was not the case and they both look, instead, rigid and stiff and as though they'd rather be anywhere else. Soon, the photographer let them go, allowing the two of them to make their way to the reception area. As they stood outside the door, the reception waiting just beyond its doors, Hiccup called Astrid to a halt and turned towards us. "Are you okay?" he asked worriedly, his eyes showing a hint of care and attention as he looked deep into her eyes. Astrid smiled bravely and nodded. "I'll be fine. I can get through this night, and then we can move on from all of this." "Right." Astrid replied coolly, although a hint of nervousness could be heard in her voice as she looked up at Hiccup. Hiccup nodded and held her hand. "Just hold my hand, and we'll be fine." As the last word left his mouth, the door to the reception hall opened and Hiccup and Astrid were waved inside. Upon entering, Astrid's eyes scanned the room, seeing all sorts of people sitting amongst the tables in the hall and at the far end, she could see her space along the long table stretching at the furthest end of the room. As she looked around, her eyes met her father's, a stern, scornful but menacing look covering his eyes as he smiled wickedly at the young couple entering the room. Astrid held Hiccup's hand tighter as her father's gaze worried her, and Hiccup squeezed her hand back in comfort. Looking down at her, Hiccup could see that she had grown visibly nervous since he had last looked at her before the door and it concerned him to not know what had caused it. However, they continued to be led across the room and eventually came to sit down at their allocated seats at the head of the room. "You're looking beautiful today," Astrid Stoic whispered to her. Astrid nodded in flattery at his compliment and smiled lightly. Stoic sat next to Hiccup, who sat next to Astrid. Astrid had to lean forward to look at Stoic who was beside Hiccup and smiled at her father-in-law. "Thank you, sir," she replied automatically, not much thought going into her words. Stoic realizes her words and lets out a beaming smile. "Come on now, we're family. You can just call me Stoic." He smiled broadly with a hearty chuckle at his words. Astrid, meanwhile, felt her heart plummet in her chest as she realized his words, their weight finally sinking over her. She was part of Hiccup's family, as much as Hiccup was a part of hers. They were actually married now, and this was all getting too real. But, taking in a deep breath, Astrid calmed herself down and cooled down her thoughts. Nothing had happened yet, they were still at the start. Closing her eyes slightly as she took in another deep breath, Hiccup looked over to her and furrowed his brow at her actions. "Are you okay?" Hiccup asked again, concern laced in his voice. "I'm fine." "Are you sure?" Astrid sighed forcefully, opening her eyes to look out onto the vast crowd that filled the hall. As the couple had sat down, things had begun to pick up and the conversations were running again, food beginning to be served between tables and raucous laughter filling the hall. Astrid couldn't find it in her to stomach much food, but she did her best to at least eat something. "Try this," Hiccup offered, placing a plate of food in front of her. It was something simple and easy to stomach, and it made Astrid glad that Hiccup understood her nervousness. Soon, the food was taken away and she noticed a few of the guests beginning to circulate the room, greeting other guests along their way and occasionally looking up towards Hiccup and Astrid at the head of the hall. Astrid noticed her father and Stoic rise and leave the table, circulating the room themselves. As they did, Astrid managed to catch a few words of their conversations, easily hearing Stoic's voice over the loud conversations filling the hall. "Oh, my. I don't know whether that will happen yet. But I've always had my fingers crossed for that boy. Hopefully, Astrid will be eating for too soon." Stoic laughed, his words ringing in Astrid's head and causing her stomach to lurch. Another voice called up over the noise, grabbing Astrid's attention as it echoed across the room. She instantly recognized the voice as her father's and looked over in his direction to see him talking to some familiar-looking board members. "Of course, I wouldn't want my daughter to rush anything. But if she is willing to have a bun in the oven, I would do nothing to stop her." He chuckled, taking a sip from the champagne flute that rested in his hand. "I wouldn't be too surprised if she can't get knocked up by that Hiccup. He doesn't look like he's got much to offer in that department." She heard another voice say, their words scathing and insulting, and caused her to look over to Hiccup. His fists had clenched and his eyes were focused upon the men who had spoken those words. "Honestly, I don't think Hiccup will have trouble. I think he may have trouble with his wife. She doesn't look that much, does she? Well, I wouldn't worry too much about grandchildren. I'm sure they'll be on the way soon enough." Neither one of them was enjoying the ideal chit-chat of the family and friends that had filled the hall around them, and neither one of them wanted to stay there any longer. The innuendos and double entendres of pregnancy and grandchildren were starting to take their toll on them. Yet, they had to. They had to endure so much more of this chatter. "Ah, Hiccup." A voice called out. Both Hiccup and Astrid faced forwards and saw a stocky, bearded man approaching the two of them. Hiccup recognized the face and smiled brightly at the man's presence. "Spitaloot. How are you?" he asked cheerfully, trying to remove any anger that he was previously feeling from his eavesdropping. "I'm doing all right. I mean, look at you. I thought you'd be the last person I'd see getting married." Spitaloot chuckled, dousing Hiccup's spirits again. "And Astrid, you are looking lovely today, as always. I expect I'll be seeing someone else joining us soon in your little family." Spitaloot chuckled, but Astrid's expression fell as her gaze dropped to the floor. Hiccup chuckled, trying to brush off the uncomfortable comment that Spitaloot had just made towards his new wife, and smiled brightly, hiding his gritted teeth. "Oh, stop it. I think it's too early for that." Hiccup tried to stop the conversation before it could grow any further. "My dear boy," Spitaloot interjected. "It's never too early for that." Slamming her hands loudly down onto the table, Astrid stood up from her chair suddenly. Most of the room fell silent from her loud action, turning their head curiously in her direction. However, Astrid's gaze was fixed upon the floor, not daring to look upon the crowd's piercing gazes. Instead, she gritted her teeth and spoke quietly. "I think I'm going to get some air. I shouldn't be too long." Astrid quickly made her way out of the reception and wasn't seen for the rest of the night. Chapter 10, Chapter 9. Chapter text. It had been 2 hours, and Astrid still hadn't returned. Hiccup was starting to worry. He had been waiting at their table for hours, waiting for Astrid to return so that they could both push through this evening together. But Astrid was nowhere to be found. As the night dragged on, and the true party began as the tables were tidied away and the floor cleared for the evening disco, Hiccup felt his stomach lurch and chest tighten. He was beginning to panic. It surprised him how long it took him to panic, but now that he was feeling it, he was desperate to leave. Finally being able to squeeze himself away from the party, the disco kicked into action almost immediately as raucous, drunk men began to fill the dance floor. Hiccup emerged into an empty hallway, finding his way to the bottom of the stairs that led to the upstairs rooms, where he would be conveniently staying the night. "Hiccup." A familiar feminine voice called out to him. Hiccup whipped his head around and came face to face with Heather, turning his back on the staircase behind him. "Heather. What are you doing here? I didn't think you were invited." Hiccup questioned, a look of confusion passing over his features. Heather shrugged with a small smile. "Well, I couldn't miss your big day, could I? Heather replied cheerfully, placing a gentle hand over her chest. As her eyes looked up at Hiccup, she spotted another figure making its way down the steps behind them. They were wearing a beautiful white dress that flowed down their figure but didn't reveal too much about them. Their blonde hair seemed ragged and untidy as they carefully made their way down the stairs. Heather noticed a peculiar expression dusting their features, the figure's eyes coasting along the floor until they reached Hiccup and his secretary. Smiling wickedly to herself, Heather focused her attention back on Hiccup and wrapped her arms around his neck. Pulling him close, their noses met but Heather could not pull any closer as Hiccup held her shoulders away from him. However, from behind, they looked much closer than they were. Astrid, who had been making her way down the stairs, suddenly felt all her willpower and bravery seep out of her like a waterfall and she angrily stomped her way back up the stairs. She couldn't believe that she was willing to trust Hiccup and help him out through the night, believing that he was alone during the party. Instead, Hiccup had found his own fun and was busily making out with his secretary right in front of the reception. It was like someone had just stabbed Astrid in the heart as she made the short journey back to her hotel room. Knowing that she wouldn't be going back down anytime soon, Astrid squeezed and ripped her way out of her wedding dress, not caring if it tore or ripped in any place, she just wanted to get out of the infernal contraption. Once she was out, Astrid found herself some comfortable clothes and decided to have a soothing and relaxing bath while the evening was still young. Hiccup was busy anyway. Heather, what in Thor's name do you think you're doing? Hiccup questioned his secretary angrily. He never raised his voice often, but back at the bottom of the stairs with the blaring music in the background, Hiccup felt the need to express his anger. What? It's not like this marriage is actually real. And we both know that I'm much better for you than her. Heather flipped her hair over her shoulders suggestively, showing off her neck to the young man before her. Yet, Hiccup felt a small amount of bile seep into the back of his throat and he was forced to, once again, push Heather away from him and maintain a secure distance from her. Heather. He pinched his nose in frustration, we could never work. You know that. Hiccup told her sternly, his words serious and cold. But we could if you gave me a chance. No, we couldn't. I'm sorry. You don't love me, you love the idea of me and the idea of the life you think we would have. But, I'm sorry. I'm not the man you think I am. I'm not the same man you see at work, I'm so much worse than that. I could never be a good husband to someone like you. Hiccup lowers his head and shakes it gently in regret, I'm sorry Heather, but I don't think I can work with you anymore. If it keeps being like this between us. Hiccup sighed, I'm sorry but I'm going to have to let you go. Hiccup spoke softly before he turned around and slowly made his way up the stairs, heading for his hotel room. Making his way upstairs, Hiccup felt a sense of relief pass over him as the noise of the party faded away and was soon drowned out by the perfect silence of the hall that he was walking down. Hiccup let out a small sigh as he found himself in front of his hotel room, fumbling around in his pockets. He reached for the key and retrieved it from his pocket. As he put the key in the latch and began to unlock the door, he heard a tremendous crash from inside the room and a grunt of pain. Without putting much thought into the action, Hiccup burst through the door and entered the room in a hurried panic. His eyes scanned the room around him to see nothing much out of order but saw a partially naked woman on the floor of his room. Astrid, who was lying prone on the floor at Hiccup's feet, sensed the new presence in the room and froze. Her belly was flat on the floor, and luckily her lower half was covered. Turning her head slowly over her shoulder, her eyes met Hiccup's and both of their faces turned bright red in shock and embarrassment. Could you? Astrid began, her voice barely audible as she tried to gesture for Hiccup to turn away. Not look. Oh, right. Hiccup exclaimed, turning around with a tomato blush dusting over his cheeks. In his lifetime, he had never seen a naked woman before, in real life. Obviously, during puberty, he had seen pictures and magazines. But to see the real thing, in front of him. His heart was racing through his chest as he tried thinking pure thoughts to stop any untoward reaction in his body. Meanwhile, Astrid rushed about to find a shirt. After falling over her bag on her way to finding a shirt, she hadn't been expecting visitors. As she grabbed the shirt off of her bed and pulled it over her head, Astrid thanked the gods that she landed on her belly and so most of her body was hidden from Hiccup's innocent eyes. He didn't need to see the scars yet. Okay, I'm done, Astrid announced shyly, bowing her head as Hiccup slowly turned around to face her. Right, Hiccup said as he turned to face her, unwilling to meet her eyes. Hiccup scratched the back of his neck nervously. Why did you leave? Hiccup asked worriedly, his mind coming back to the reason he was there. Oh, Astrid tried to scramble for her words, at least some words that didn't make her seem like some kind of cowardly lunatic. I was embarrassed, Astrid admitted. She didn't know why she admitted that fact, she wasn't too sure she wanted to, but the words were spilling from her mouth before she could stop them. Why? Hiccup asked automatically, his face dropping into one of concern. Astrid sighed exhaustedly, her shoulders slumped as the air left her lungs. Because this whole thing isn't supposed to be real, but I feel so guilty about getting their hopes up when in reality none of it will become true. Astrid sighed, sitting down on the double bed in the middle of the room, her head collapsing into her hands. I know it's stupid, but I keep feeling I owe them all something after getting married, even though that was all they wanted. Hiccup stood before her, not knowing what to do with himself. He felt uncomfortable sitting next to her and consoling her because he was unsure whether that would just upset Astrid even more. Instead, he stood before her and let out a small sigh of frustration and tiredness as he gave his neck another scratch. I mean, did you think you were the only one who thought that way? Hiccup asked, his hand still stretching up to his neck as his fingers scratched against the skin. Astrid looked up at him slowly, their eyes meeting as Hiccup gave her a small, nervous smile. Kneeling in front of her, Hiccup held Astrid's tear-stained hands and held them in his own comfortingly. Look, I know that this whole thing isn't real. Astrid's mind was cast back to the moment she had witnessed between him and Heather, but that doesn't mean that it can never be real. We don't have to live in hatred of each other for the rest of this marriage. It can be real enough if we let it be. Hiccup suggested, a hint of hopefulness to his voice as he looked up at Astrid. However, her expression had hardened and she was looking down at their hands with disgust. You mean as real as your relationship with your secretary? Astrid mocked, her voice twinged with a small hint of hurt as she tore her hands out of Hiccup's grasp. Yet, Hiccup looked up at her confused and curious as he tilted his head in thought. Looking back up at her, Hiccup furrowed his brow in confusion. Astrid, what are you talking about? There's no relationship between me and Heather. She's just my secretary. Hiccup answered honestly, his voice curious and weak as he looked at Astrid's angry expression. Of course there is, don't lie to me. I saw you together. At the bottom of the stairs. Hiccup's eyes widened as he realized what event she was talking about. He was about to explain himself, but Astrid was already cutting him off again. Look, don't explain yourself. I get it. You want to be with her instead of me, all I ask is that you don't go making out where you can easily be seen by everyone. Then our cover will definitely be blown. Astrid stood up furiously, making her way over to the large window that overlooked a beautiful lake. As she stood before it, she turned her head to look over her shoulder. You said you've never kissed someone before, I guess that was a lie. Hiccup felt his heart drop. Something in her words made him want to drop to the floor and beg for her forgiveness. Her harshness and cold shoulder were almost tearing him apart as he watched her back staring at him, her face looking out the window not daring to look at him for another second. Instead, with a heavy sigh, Hiccup made his way over to the bathroom and got himself cleaned up for the night. Leaving Astrid alone in the room, Hiccup took a cold shower, punishing himself for his actions. He couldn't believe he was so naive into thinking that Astrid would have never seen him, or that she would have understood his perspective. Of course, she wouldn't. She was married to him and would be jealous of every girl who threw themselves at him. Wait. Was she jealous? Hiccup tried to subdue the small smile that threatened to appear on his face as the thought crossed his mind and the words left his mouth. He tried to dispel the thought and continue with his shower, but the words continued to bug him at the back of his mind. As Hiccup emerged into the room, he found Astrid making the couch comfortable, adjusting a pillow on the bed to the armrest against the couch. Hiccup furrowed his brow and walked over to her to help her adjust the blanket and pillows she had set out for herself. I'll take the couch, you take the bed. Hiccup suggested, which caused a scoff to erupt from Astrid's mouth. Did you think I was making a bed on the couch for me? She chuckled slightly. Oh no, I was going to make you sleep on the couch. But hey, now that you're volunteering, that takes the weight off my shoulders in telling you where you'll be sleeping. She smiled maniacally at him before jumping into the bed and making herself comfortable. As she made herself comfortable under the sheets of the bed, sitting herself up against the headboard of the bed, she looked over to Hiccup, who was still standing where she had left him. He was staring down at the couch in front of him, frozen. Smiling to herself, Astrid took out her phone and looked through her social media. Don't think about crossing any boundaries. As you said, this whole thing will be over in a year, so let's not cross any boundaries that could cause us to develop feelings for one another. Astrid spoke emotionlessly, her mind preoccupied with searching through social media on her phone. Hiccup rolled his eyes and began to climb into the makeshift bed that had been constructed upon the cushions of the couch. What was I thinking? Jealous, my foot, Hiccup muttered to himself, scolding himself for believing that a girl like her could ever be jealous of a guy like him. Chapter 11, Chapter 10. Chapter text. A loud, obnoxious knocking sound echoed throughout the hotel room, the incessant banging upon the door causing both Astrid and Hiccup to stir. Groaning in annoyance, Hiccup stirred awake first, his eyes unwilling to open for the morning light. However, turning over on the couch and falling haphazardly to the floor, Hiccup woke himself up. The fall to the floor created a loud thump as his body met the carpeted floor, and a concerned voice called out through the door. Hiccup. Astrid. Is everything all right in there? Open up, I want to talk to you. Stoic's booming, authoritative voice called out to them from the other side of the door. His voice caused Hiccup's body to freeze as he began to haul himself up from the floor. What was his father doing here? Hiccup took a moment to glance over at Astrid's bed and saw her still locked in a deep sleep. He admired her peaceful sleeping face and stumbled over to the door lazily. As he opened the door, he was greeted with the sight of his father, a fist still raised to the door ready to knock again. He looked over Hiccup's figure, which was being held up by the door that he had sleepily flung his weight onto, and was steadily maintaining his balance with it. Dear Odin, boy. You look a mess. Stoic observed as his eyes scanned his son's figure. I guess you are a young lad, but I didn't think you two would hit it off quite so well. Stoic exclaimed before Hiccup shushed him harshly. Hiccup wanted to laugh at his words, the idea of sleeping with a girl like Astrid being something of a teenage dream. Especially after last night's words. Hiccup looked up at his father lazily and gave him a stern look. Dad, why are you here? He asked curiously, sleep still trying to work its way through his body and wake him up. Well, you see, son. Stoic started, but then all of his words disappeared and he was left with his mouth open and nothing further to say. You know what, how about you come downstairs? Get all packed and ready in, shall we say half an hour? And I'll meet you there. You see, Thorold and I have a little surprise for you and Astrid. Stoic smiled brightly, his eyes lit up with excitement. See you downstairs in half an hour. Hiccup agreed, slamming the door in his father's face and retreating into the room. With a heavy sigh, Hiccup walked back into the room. Wiping his face in annoyance and frustration, Hiccup let out a loud groan and stormed over to the bed. Admiring Astrid's sleeping face for a moment, taking in her peaceful features and rosy lips that drew Hiccup's eye, Hiccup dragged the sheets off of her body with a forceful tug and threw them to the bottom of the bed. Astrid's exposure to the coldness of the room caused a shiver to ripple through her body and slowly stir her awake from sleep. Hiccup sighed and shook his head as Astrid slowly awoke from sleep, whilst he began to pack up his things and gather together some clothes for the day. What's going on? Astrid asked sleepily, a small yawn evident in her voice as she wiped her eyes. Sitting up on the bed, she noticed Hiccup's erratic movements around the room, dashing about to gather clothes and fold them into his bag. Pack your things and get changed. We're meeting our parents downstairs, he said they have a surprise for us. Hiccup spoke whilst hurling things into his suitcase. His suitcase was only small, it only had a few clothes in it that were suitable for an overnight stay, as well as his pristine suit for the wedding. As he packed, he grabbed a few comfortable, presentable clothes for himself and dashed into the bathroom to wash up and change. Oh, by the way. Hiccup called out from within the bathroom as Astrid slowly made her way off the bed, they want to see us downstairs in half an hour, better be quick. He called out to her with a hint of amusement in his tone as he felt a surge of panic and hurry to wash over Astrid from within the room. Widening her eyes, Astrid dashed about the room to tidy up her things and pack them away, also remembering to fish out some clothes for the day as she did so. There was no care or attention given to the clothing as she pushed them fiercely into her suitcase, her wedding dress stuffed beneath everything in the case to hide her shame. Soon, Hiccup emerged from the bathroom and was rudely pushed aside as Astrid dashed inside, rushing past Hiccup with a harsh nudge as she closed the door in his face. Hiccup scoffed and smiled at her actions, making his way over to his bag and putting the last few things inside before standing by the door. After a few more minutes, Astrid hauled her suitcase up to the door and stood before Hiccup. Casting an eye over her, Hiccup took the time to look at her disheveled hair, askew clothing and dark circles as she stood before him, still trying to get dressed. "Well, are we going?" she asked out of breath, still trying to adjust her shirt and trousers as she stood before him. Hiccup chuckled at her state and allowed a bright smile to cross his features. "Come here," he said softly and grabbed her arms, pinning them down to her sides. As her arms were pulled away, Hiccup's hands replaced her own and began to adjust her shirt and jacket, which was lying haphazardly over her shoulders. He brushed her hair down, detangling any observed knots that decorated her hair like freshly fallen snow. He bent down to the floor and tidily tied her shoelaces, making sure it wasn't too tight on her feet, but not too loose to fall off. "We don't want your parents thinking we had a quickie before we made our way downstairs," Hiccup joked as he sorted out Astrid's rugged look. Astrid couldn't stop the small blush from forming on her cheeks at Hiccup's words but shrugged off the weird feeling and took his words as they were. A joke. Standing back to his feet, Hiccup looked up to meet Astrid's blushing face. The look on her face caused him to let out another chuckle and pat her shoulder softly. "Now you're more presentable. Let's go." Turning around and grabbing his suitcase, Hiccup opened the door and exited the room followed by Astrid. "You wish we had one," Astrid muttered egotistically beneath her breath as Hiccup placed his hotel key back in his pocket and smiled at her barely audible words. "I think any guy who's ever laid eyes upon you would think so, milady," Hiccup sassed before walking down the corridor and towards the lobby downstairs. Astrid's mind was screaming at her to say something to dispel the awkwardness she was feeling between the two of them after Hiccup's jest at the door. However, Astrid didn't say a word, her blush still evident from earlier as the scene played over in her mind and his words swirling around her ears like a broken record player. He was close to her. Too close. "Ah, Hiccup." "Astrid." A friendly, jovial voice called out to the young couple as they finally descended the stairs and made their way over to them. Stoic and Thorold, along with his wife, stood near the door into the manor in which they had held the wedding reception. Stoic was smiling at the young couple, welcoming them towards him as they made their way down the stairs. Thorold's eye was trained on Astrid, searching for impurities upon her body. But when he saw nothing, a wicked smile stretched across his face. "Morning, Dad. How are you?" Hiccup asked, a sense of tiredness in his voice as he looked up at his father. Stoic smiled and gave his son a slap across the back in a fatherly way, although it felt like an assault upon Hiccup's body. "Well, son. Why don't you bring your wife outside and I'll take you somewhere in the car? We prepared a surprise for you too," Stoic announced excitedly, a hand wrapped around his son's shoulders and gently coercing him outside and towards the car waiting at the bottom of the steps. Astrid followed behind, a sense of awkwardness and embarrassment sweeping over her as she felt her mother's piercing gaze upon her as she walked behind her husband and his father. She wasn't sure what she was getting into, but he felt as though she was beginning to wade into the deep end. "Hop in," Stoic exclaimed, gesturing to the car as a chauffeur took their bags from them and shoved them, rather forcefully, into the boot of the car. Astrid looked at Hiccup with a furrowed brow, but he only replied with a small shrug. Stepping forward, Hiccup opened the car door and gestured for Astrid to hop inside first. Thanking him with a smile, Astrid climbed inside and belted herself in, nervous for the journey ahead. The journey was far from quiet. Stoic wasn't the type to keep a room without noise. Instead, the couple had to sit through what was a good 20-minute drive of Stoic's long, painful anecdotes and incessant innuendos about having children. By the end of the journey, as the car was pulling into a nice-looking housing estate, both Hiccup and Astrid were feeling pretty irate about their current situation, and couldn't wait to be alone for a while. Thankfully, the car came to a stop and the couple were allowed to exit the car. However, upon exiting the car, they were greeted by the magnificent sight of a grand, two-storied, large mansion standing before them. It was painted white with black-edged windows that decorated the exterior of the house beautifully. Stoic turned to them with a broad smile and clapped his hands together, reveling in the amazed faces of his son and daughter-in-law. Smiling wide, Stoic approached the newlyweds and placed a hand on each of their shoulders. "Welcome, to your new home." Hiccup and Astrid felt their breaths hitch. They were supposed to be living there together. In the same home. Under the same roof. Together. Neither one of them had planned, nor even thought about this contingency. Hiccup gulped worriedly as he turned to look at Astrid and then back at the house. His heart raced in his chest as he thought about the possible futures he could have in this house, and none of them worked out well for him. Astrid, on the other hand, felt her stomach churn and her heart leap into her throat. There was no way she was going to be able to survive under the same roof as Hiccup. His sweetness might cause her to have a heart attack one day. Or he might try and bring his girlfriend over too. Shaking her head to dispel the thought and be rid of it instantly, Astrid turned to Stoic with a smile. "It's beautiful, Stoic. But can we really have this?" she asked guiltily, widening her eyes in pleading as Stoic let out an amused laugh at her words. "Of course, you can have this, Astrid. It was bought for you, so it will be yours." Stoic laughed again, but this did nothing to soothe Astrid as she lowered her head and stared up at the large building. "Besides, I doubt you will be wanting to live with your parents when starting your new family. Newlyweds need their privacy after all." He joked, but it didn't settle well with Astrid and Hiccup. "It's just too much," Astrid muttered to herself. In fact, Stoic begins again, leaning close to the two of them with a smile. "We have already brought all of your things and left them in the hall. Hiccup, your stuff is on the right as you enter, Astrid, yours will be on the left." Stoic gave the young couple another slap on the back. "Right then, I'd best be off to let you two settle into your new home." And with that, Stoic got in the car and left the couple standing on the driveway. "I sure hope this house has more than one bedroom because I am not sleeping in the same room as you," Astrid said through gritted teeth as they watched Stoic's car fade over the horizon. "No arguments here, milady." Shaking themselves awake, Hiccup and Astrid strode up to the house and opened its front doors into a large hallway. The entrance hall to the house was long and wide, enough to fit a car through it. Astrid widened her eyes at the size of the hall and her gaze soon fell upon her pile of belongings at the left of the door. Rushing towards them, she looked through the boxes to see what her parents had packed for her. Her eyes cast over the boxes, searching for valuables and photos or any kind of memorabilia that she treasured. Yet, she found nothing. "Hey, Astrid!" Hiccup called out to her. Whipping her head around, Astrid turned to face Hiccup with a look of curiosity. "Yeah? What's up?" she asked as she saw Hiccup approaching her with a letter in his hand. "I think you should read this," Hiccup said before handing her the letter. Giving him a confused look, she took the letter from his grasp and began reading it aloud to herself. "Dear Hiccup," and Astrid Haddock, she cringed at that. "I hope you are delighted with our wedding gift and that this house will serve you well on your journey together as a new family. Both Thorold, Erica and I pitched in to buy you this house, and I think you'll agree that it was the best one on the market for a young couple such as yourselves." Astrid looked over to Hiccup before turning back to the letter. "We have furnished the rooms already and prepared the kitchen with enough food for the week. We want you both to enjoy this week together because you won't be having a honeymoon, and so you'll both be having this week off." Her eyes widened in surprise as she read those words. "Your work will be handled by the right people and the company, so just relax and enjoy your time together. Love, Stoic." Astrid finished, her breath escaping her as she looked over the letter one last time. "A week off? What kind of baloney is that?" Hiccup complained as he threw his hands up in the air exasperatedly. Astrid rolled her eyes and let out a small chuckle, which caused Hiccup to whip his head around in frustration and anger. "Is this funny to you?" he asked accusingly. "No," Astrid put her hands up in defense. "I'm just seeing the positive side of things," she announced before smiling brightly, a smile that left Hiccup momentarily stunned. "We get the week off. And Hiccup, have you ever had a holiday in your life? Enjoy it." Chapter 12, Chapter 11. Chapter text. "So, what do we do now?" Hiccup asked as the two of them stood in silence for a few moments. Astrid let out a small sigh and looked over the letter in her hand once more. She really hated this situation, and her parents were just making things worse. Looking up at Hiccup, Astrid strode forwards and stood before his pile of belongings, looking over it pensively. "Well, I don't know about you, but I want to have a quick look around the place before I move in," Astrid announced decidedly, her words firm but her voice wavered slightly as she tried to act calm and collected. Hiccup looked at her back in amusement, her body facing away from him as he walked past her to his pile of belongings. Chuckling to himself, he strode up beside Astrid and nodded in agreement with a smile. "Yeah, that sounds like a plan." Hiccup motioned her forwards. "Lead on." Rolling her eyes, Astrid made her way around the house with Hiccup following behind like a lost puppy. Making her way through the rooms, she noticed all of them were furnished very basically, with no undue furniture scattered about the room for decoration. Every piece of furniture in each room had a purpose and a need, each one being essential to the room it fitted into. As the couple made their way upstairs, not a single word was spoken between them. Soon, they found themselves standing in a narrow corridor. On one side of the corridor, there was a door to the master bedroom, on the other side, there was a door leading into the guest bedroom. Both doors faced each other, and both were the only bedrooms in the house. Astrid just hoped that both of them were furnished. Turning around to face him, stopping Hiccup from entering the master bedroom first, Astrid held out a hand and stopped him in his tracks. Hiccup looked at her in confusion and raised his eyebrows at her actions. "Astrid, what are you doing?" he asked with a small chuckle in his voice. "How about we make this interesting?" Astrid challenged, immediately piquing Hiccup's interest. "Go on. How about we play a little game to determine who gets what room? Like, rock paper scissors to see who takes the room on which side," Astrid suggested with a shrug of her shoulders. Hiccup raised his eyebrows at her words but shrugged with a nonchalant look in his eyes. "What the hell? Why not?" Hiccup said and held his hand out in a fist. "Rock paper scissors. Whoever wins gets to choose a room. Right or left?" He smiled, holding out his hand in a friendly challenge to her suggestion. Smiling brightly, Astrid accepted and held out her hand ready to challenge him with a game of rock paper scissors. However, the game did not finish immediately as Astrid had once thought. Instead, their game of rock paper scissors went on for a minute, at least. Their actions continued to tie as they made the same gesture every time they completed the chant of rock paper scissors. "Ha! I win!" Astrid yells in delight as she finally broke the system and defeated Hiccup's rock with paper. Sighing exhaustedly, Hiccup lowers his head in defeat and gestures for her to take her prize. Although a part of him was glad that she won, he got the feeling that she would be a rather sore loser. "Go on, choose a room." Astrid smiled and raised her head up haughtily, a sense of pride and achievement flooding over her as she strode forwards. Turns out that she was also a bit of an unpleasant winner. Standing between the two doors, she looked back and forth between each one. With a heavy sigh, Astrid took the room on the left and opened the door. "Oh, Thor." She sighed as she lowered her head, resting it in her hands as she shook her head solemnly. Meanwhile, Hiccup opened the other door and was greeted by the magnificent sight of the master bedroom. But it contained a slight twist. Astrid." Hiccup called out nervously, gaining Astrid's attention. Peeking over his shoulder, she looked into the bedroom in front of him and sputtered out a laugh. "Oh, gods!" he sighed, shaking his own head. Both of them felt like they'd lost. Looking out into the master bedroom, they saw that the bed was completely covered in rose petals, the mess dusting over onto the floor. In the middle of the bed sat a set of couple's pajamas and a bottle of champagne. The young couple felt their cheeks burn at the sight, noticing candles dotted around the room as they averted their eyes away from each other. "Well, good luck with cleaning that up," Astrid announced before dashing out of the room and racing into her own, slamming the door behind her. As she closed the door, Astrid leaned her back against the door and slowly slid down it to sit on the floor, her knees tucked into her chest. Lowering her head, shaking it gently as her hands came up to cradle it in their grasp, Astrid replayed the image of the master bedroom again in her memory. "How am I going to survive a year with all of this pushing and inappropriate nagging?" Astrid groaned, throwing her head back lightly and soundlessly placing it on the door as her eyes drifted up to the ceiling. "I mean, The room does look beautiful, and the roses. Asterisk 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 asterisk. A few hours passed, and the evening was drawing near. Astrid's stomach growled as she sat in her bed, her back resting against the headboard as she scrolled through her phone. With a small sigh, she looked down at her rumbling stomach and curiously looked over to the door, wondering whether Hiccup had emerged from his room and the coast was clear. After choosing their rooms, both Hiccup and Astrid gathered their belongings and packed them into their room, organizing their things into their separate rooms. There was no argument from Hiccup or Astrid about the prospect of sleeping in different rooms as the decision seemed mutual. With a burst of confidence and overbearing hunger, Astrid decided it was time to re-emerge from the room and make her way down to the kitchen. She crept out into the corridor and sneakily made her way down to the kitchen. As she entered the kitchen, she was reminded of how enormous the rooms in the house were. There was a large kitchen island stretching across the middle of the room, and the rest of the kitchen seemed to be decorated and furnished around this kitchen island in the middle of the room. The color scheme of the room seemed very bland, with the cupboards being a simple grey color and the countertops being a dark, airy black. Astrid made her way over to the fridge and swung it open to reveal the food inside. Instead of seeing a full fridge, with easy-to-make meals ready inside, there was every ingredient needed to create a full-course meal for 2 people, spreading over the entire week. Wow, there really is enough food in here to last us a week, Astrid muttered to herself as she looked over the various foods filling the fridge in front of her. However, lowering her head with a heavy but regretful sigh, Astrid closed the fridge door and slumped onto one of the kitchen stools that surrounded the island in the middle of the room. She couldn't cook to save her life, so living in this house without easy-to-make meals, such as noodle pots and microwave meals, she was going to starve. Her gaze scattered across the room, searching for something easy to cook. Suddenly, her eyes fell upon a cabinet above one of the countertops. She wasn't sure what was inside, but something told her that that was the cupboard she was looking for. Making her way over to it sheepishly, Astrid opened up the cupboard to be met with a vast array of various pasta species. The various shapes, sizes and colors of each of these pasta bags shocked her somewhat, and her breath hitched as she felt another plummeting feeling hit her stomach. If she couldn't cook, could Hiccup? She hoped he could. But she couldn't just go and ask him to cook for her, that would be ridiculous. Her pride would be hurt by that. Instead, Astrid let out a small sigh and grabbed a random packet of pasta and slammed it down on the countertop. Reading the instructions, Astrid filled up a pan of water and began boiling it on the stove. The stove was easy to work, but Astrid wasn't sure when the water was ready and watched the pan of water slowly bubble away to itself. Soon, larger bubbles appeared in the pan and Astrid took that as her cue to put the pasta in. As she poured it, another thought came to her mind: how much is necessary for one person? Her mind finally caught up to what she was doing and saw the pasta reach above the level of water in the pan. Stopping pouring the pasta, Astrid placed it to the side of the hob and allowed the water to continue to boil and cook the pasta. Thinking that everything was going well, Astrid turned around and brought out her phone, quickly checking over her social media. Scrolling through the pages, her mind closed off to the outside world around her, so she didn't notice the pan of boiling water bubbling furiously behind her, the water beginning to topple over the sides. Hearing hurried footsteps rushing towards her, Astrid looked up from her phone just in time to see Hiccup dashing towards her with a panicked look on his face. Hiccup, in a quick deft movement, hurried over to Astrid and grabbed her waist with one hand, pulling her close, and with the other hand grabs the pan of boiling water filled with pasta off of the hob and hovered it in midair. His hand shook slightly with the weight of the pan as he tried to hold it high above the counter. But he quickly put the pan down on the cold countertop and looked over at Astrid with a worried but scornful expression. "What in Thor's name were you playing at? You could have burned yourself. Do you not know how to cook or something?" Hiccup asked, a slight alarm and scolding tone to his voice as he looked down at Astrid. However, Hiccup didn't seem to be too bothered about the closeness of their bodies. Unlike Astrid, her hands were pinned against Hiccup's chest, her waist connected with his as his arm kept her locked tight in place. Her gaze was in direct eye line with his chest and shoulder, and so when she looked up at Hiccup, she had a perfect sight line of his sharp jaw. She took the moment to notice a few frazzled beard hairs beginning to show through the bottom of his chin, and a small scar on his chin that seemed extremely old. "Could you?" Astrid muttered, kindly gesturing to their close proximity caused by Hiccup's panicked actions. Please. Hiccup looked her up and down and widened his eyes, quickly letting go of her. Oh, sorry, he apologized, scratching the back of his head nervously whilst Astrid tried to calm the racing beat of her heart. I barely realized. I just acted instinctively, I guess. Her breath had left her body as she can picture how close his face was to hers. She could feel the shape and firm press of his chest against hers as she was pinned against his side by his strong grip. Astrid could tell that Hiccup didn't need large muscles on his arms or broad shoulders and a muscled back to make him strong. He had it all within him waiting for Hiccup to find. Shaking her head out of her wistful thoughts about Hiccup, Astrid looked up to Hiccup with innocent-looking eyes and pouted sadly at his scolding. Hiccup looked at her with a confused look ghosting over his eyes, but an amused smile spread over his lips as his eyes took in the surroundings around him. What were you doing? He asked, letting out a soft chuckle at her actions and the cooling pot of pasta on the countertop. Or at least, what were you trying to do? I was trying to cook something without asking, and I'm also trying to avoid being scolded by you. It's my form of apology. She admits cutely as she gestured to the pouty expression on her face which caused Hiccup to laugh with a broad smile. His smile filled Astrid with warmth as she watched it spread across Hiccup's lips like an infectious disease. A small animalistic sense rose up to her throat and begged to be let out as a sudden thought struck the forefront of her mind. Mine. Okay, you got me there. I won't scold you, so long as you stop making that ridiculous face. It's kind of scary. Hiccup continued to laugh lightly, gently clutching his stomach as he let out the last of his laughter. Astrid dropped her pouty face and returned to a neutral expression. But can you seriously not cook? He asked in concern, trying to dispel any further laughter from within him and remain serious. Astrid sighed and slumped herself on one of the kitchen stools, her back hunched and her figure limp. No. She admitted sadly, when I was young I had everything done for me. There was no need to learn to cook. And then when I moved out, I almost burned my apartment down and so just resorted to cooking simple microwave meals and instant pots. Astrid sighed again, slumping her shoulders down. Why didn't you just tell me? I would cook for you. Hiccup offered kindly, his words warming her heart and making Astrid feel guilty for being so hostile towards him. Because it's embarrassing. I'm 25 years old and I don't know how to cook anything, even pasta. Astrid gestured to the steaming pan of pasta that had been left forgotten on the countertop. And I'm supposed to be your wife. I'm the one who typically cooks for the family. Hey, pasta can be tricky sometimes. Hiccup defended, looking over his shoulder at the pan and then returning his gaze back to Astrid. Kneeling down in front of her, Hiccup grabbed Astrid's hands that lay in her lap and gave her a significant look. Astrid, we live together now. I was going to learn about this certain quirk of yours eventually. Besides, I can teach you. I know a thing or two about cooking. Really? She asked, raising an eyebrow. As hard as it is to believe, yes. Yes, I can cook. I didn't mean that. I mean, you would teach me how to cook? Astrid asked, giving Hiccup a small slap on his shoulder as he chuckled at her reaction. Of course. I can't have a wife who can't cook. He joked, earning a scowl from Astrid as he chuckled once more. Come on. Hiccup smiled up at Astrid as he knelt before her, perking up her spirits as he noticed the hopeful look in his eye. He was trying to reach out to her, find some even ground between them, and all Astrid needed to do was give in. Want me to teach you? Hiccup asked hesitantly, cringing slightly as he expected an outburst from her at the thought of the idea he was putting forward. But Astrid nodded her head with a small smile. Why not? Better now than after I've burned the house down. She joked lightly, earning a small encouraging smile from Hiccup as he rose to his feet and offered Astrid a hand to her feet off of the stool she was sitting on. The next hour was like beautiful torture. Okay, I'll wash up this pan, and we can start over. Hiccup decided, walking over to the countertop where Astrid's forgotten pan was left. So, what do you fancy for dinner? Hiccup asked as he threw away the cold, dry pasta and washed out the pan, scraping away the many pieces still stuck to the bottom. Astrid thought for a moment, tapping her chin in thought before she hauled herself up onto the counter. Her legs swung down beneath her, gently knocking against the cupboards beneath the countertop. How about bolognese? Hiccup suggested with a shrug. That way I can teach you to cook pasta properly. A smile and an enthusiastic nod from Astrid told Hiccup that she agreed. Hiccup smiled back and strode over to her, with no thought to his actions, and placed both of his hands on either side of her, trapping her beneath him. His eyes stared back into hers, his body between her legs but blocked by the counter as he leaned in closer to her with a smirk. I must warn you. This is my domain, milady. So you better put in those listening ears or we'll be having a few burnt fingers around here. He joked suggestively. The fun was only just beginning. Yes, sir. Chapter 13, Chapter 12. Chapter text. Hiccup walked across the kitchen and over to the fridge, leaving Astrid still sitting up on the counter with her hand clutching her chest. In her attempt to calm her racing heart, she had not noticed Hiccup withdrawing away from her and beginning his task of making dinner. So when Hiccup turned around from the fridge to face her, he smiled to himself and shook his head in amusement. Walking over to her, placing the packet of minced beef to the side for a moment, Hiccup flicked Astrid's head and stood a foot or so away from her, giving her room to breathe. Hiccup smiled at her vacant expression and chuckled lowly to himself. Well, are you going to help? I could use it. Hiccup asked with humor in his voice, chuckling gently as Astrid shook herself out of her daze. Jumping down from the counter, she nodded enthusiastically and grabbed the package that Hiccup had placed down on the counter beside her. Of course, where do we start? Hiccup quickly reached out and stole back the packet of mince away from Astrid's grasp with a raised eyebrow. Holding the packet in his hand, he kept it out of her reach as he gestured over to the stove. I will be handling all the important stuff. It's too early in your training to be frying the mince. So how about you get a pan and fill it with water and try boiling the water again? At least you got that bit right when you tried cooking earlier. Hiccup suggested with an amused expression, before moving his way over to the stove and placing the packet on the side. Yes, sensei. Astrid mocked as she placed her hands together and bowed with a serious face, earning a small laugh from Hiccup at her actions. Following his instructions, Astrid strode over to one of the cupboards and searched for a pan to boil the water in. As she was reaching up, her height caused her to balance on her toes as she tried reaching for a pan in the overhead cupboards. Another arm appeared above her and reached up for a pan. Their hands easily grabbed a pan from the high shelf and brought it down from the shelf. Astrid turned around and came face to face with Hiccup, their noses inches apart and his lips enticingly close to hers as he towered over her, trapping her against the cupboards once again. How about you use the pan in the sink? The one that you used before. Saves you having to reach for one of these and ending up hurting yourself. He suggested kindly, a friendly smile plastered upon his face as he looked into Astrid's eyes. Although I do like saving you like this, it's not really the time. Astrid nodded, unable to speak as she felt her breath escape her once again. Slipping away from Hiccup's trap, Astrid made her way over to the sink and gave the pan another rinse after Hiccup had washed it out earlier. Filling it up with water, after shaking herself awake for the millionth time that hour, Astrid strode over to Hiccup in front of the stove and placed the pan on one of the rings of the stove. Hiccup smiled at her efforts, the sound of sizzling meat in his pan filling his ears, but he could still hear a grunt of struggle as Astrid hauled the heavy pan of water onto the stove. Luckily, the stove was an electronic stove that required no gas, which would explain why Astrid had an easy time boiling the water, so Hiccup easily switched on the stove and put the pan of water on high heat to start it boiling. Standing side by side with each other, Hiccup and Astrid proceeded to cook dinner, the gentle sizzling sound of the meat cooking away as Hiccup explained the look of the food to know when it was done. Astrid helped Hiccup with adding the sauce to the pan when the mince was ready and carefully placed the spaghetti in the pan of boiling water. Everything was cooking nicely, and almost ready. Hiccup asked Astrid to set the table that was in the dining room, and Astrid nodded eagerly. She was excited to eat a meal that she had helped create from scratch, with the helping hands and knowledge of Hiccup by her side. Once the table was ready, Hiccup entered with 2 plates of perfectly prepared bolognese. Placing one in front of Astrid and one for himself on the opposite side of the table, Hiccup plopped himself down upon the chair exhaustedly. Astrid gave him a look of concern for a fleeting second but shook it off and grabbed her fork eagerly. Let's eat. Asterisk 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 asterisk. It had been a few days since their cooking session, and now it coming close to the end of the week, and for some reason, Hiccup was acting a little distant today. Astrid woke up that Thursday morning and hobbled tiredly down the stairs for breakfast, and there she saw Hiccup mindlessly fiddling with his soggy cereal and staring off into space. Wandering over to him, Astrid tapped his shoulder gently. As she made the motion and touched his body, Hiccup jolted suddenly and jumped from Astrid's actions, causing her to withdraw her hand and hold both up in surrender and defense. Whoa, hey. What's going on with you? Why are you so jumpy? She asked in concern and surprise, Hiccup's sudden movements sending her heart into overdrive. His actions had spooked her and made her place a soothing hand over her chest to calm down the sensation in her chest. I'm just worried, you've been staring off into space so much that your cereal has gone soggy. You sure you're okay? Sorry, Astrid. I'm fine. I've just got a lot on my mind. Hiccup replied, standing up with his cereal and making his way over to the sink and pouring it all away. Astrid watched his movement in curiosity and confusion. Hiccup had never been like this. Ever since she had met him, he had either been cold and serious or smiling and bright. There never really seemed to be an in-between with Hiccup. He always seemed genuinely happy and pleased to see everyone he met. But what Astrid was seeing before her right now, was not the man she had grown accustomed to knowing. Something was going on. You know, Hiccup. If there's anything wrong, I can help. You can tell me. Astrid offered kindly, searching and reaching out for the Hiccup that she knew. But when Hiccup turned around to face her, all light had left his eyes and she was staring at an empty shell of the man she knew earlier. I'm going out for the day, don't try and contact me. Hiccup said coldly, leaving Astrid dumbfounded in the kitchen. I don't know when I'll be back, so don't lock the door when you go to bed. Fine. She huffed, crossing her hands over her chest in frustration and anger. I don't care where you are going. I can't believe I actually thought we could be civil about this and that I tried to care. Maybe I will just lock the door, at least then I'd know where you were. Astrid huffed, making her way over to the cupboards and began to make herself breakfast. The truth was that Hiccup was preoccupied with something that he had been trying to put off for months, but now he felt like he had to do it. Hiccup was sitting on the end of his bed, his hands linked with each other as they sat upon his knees, and he looked towards the bouquet sitting upon the dresser in front of him. The flower bulbs were staring back at him, commanding him to go and do what he had been too scared to do. Okay, I'll go. I have to tell her. I can't keep lying to her. Hiccup whispered to himself and grabbed his favorite leather jacket and swung it over his shoulders. He loved that leather jacket the most. It was seemingly hundreds of years old, but it was his. Originally the jacket had belonged to his father and he had given it to his mother when she had first met Stoic. He had given it to her as a token of their first meeting. Hiccup smiled to himself as the memory of that story came to his mind, and he felt the rough texture of the leather beneath his fingers as they traced over the material. Grabbing the flowers, Hiccup dashed down the stairs, and without giving Astrid a goodbye, he left the house with a loud bang of the front door. With a heavy sigh, Hiccup climbed into his car and started the engine. The car seemed to roar into life, and that sparked another new sense of fear throughout Hiccup's body. He was really doing this. Now was the time. So, sucking in a brave breath, Hiccup backed out of the driveway in his car and drove out of the house. The road seemed quiet as he drove along through the estate, figuring his way out of the many roads and soon finding himself at the main road. From there it was an easy time making his way to his destination. As he arrived, he saw a few familiar faces and smiled at their greetings as he passed them by. Everyone had always been so nice to him when he was there, even when he was a kid. No one ever questioned why he was there, or what he was there to say. They just let him wander and speak to her. Parking his car up, and grabbing the flowers from the passenger seat, Hiccup exited the car and slammed the door shut behind him. As he turned around to stride into the place that he had admired since he was a child, a frail old woman strode up to him with her walking stick. The stick that she held was more of a staff than a walking stick, and she clung to it with both hands like a child holding onto her father's leg. She came here often to visit her husband, hoping and waiting to visit him soon as she began getting on in years. Hiccup greeted her with a smile and knelt on the ground with his arms out in a warm hug. Graciously accepting, she hugged him tight. Having known him since he was a teenager 10 years ago, the two of them had grown rather close. "How are you, Gothai?" Hiccup asked quietly, before pulling away from her and repeating the line for her in sign language. Gothai wasn't a tall old woman, she was probably only a meter in height and so forced Hiccup to kneel on the floor to match her height. When Hiccup first met Gothai, her hearing was beginning to fade, and together they learned sign language. Hiccup wasn't too sure about the whole thing, but helping Gothai was his main priority when learning the language, and now they could sign to each other fluently. Smiling up at the grown man before her, she signed back to him. "I'm okay. Here to see her?" she asked, with a curious face. Hiccup nodded and Gothai smiled up at him. "Well, I think she's waiting for you." With that, Gothai hobbled off over to her car. A driver stood by the door awaiting her return. Hiccup watched her go and slowly stood back up to his full height. With a heavy sigh, Hiccup glanced down at the flowers in his hand and then back up to Gothai's car, which had begun to drive out of the car park. "I guess it's now or never," Hiccup muttered to himself before he turned around and strode into the place that he's been dreading entering for months. Stepping through the gates, Hiccup could see the full extent of the cemetery before him. He could see all the people lining up along the path, staring at him as he entered through the gates. Hiccup cast his eye over each stone, looking for one in particular that he had been visiting for years, more often on his own than with his father. As he cast his eyes over the stones, he saw it. He saw her. With another brave inhale, Hiccup strode down the path and headed towards the stone that he had frequented before. He knew where she'd be waiting for him, he knew what to look for, yet as he entered the cemetery he always felt the need to look for her. Standing before her stone, a large oak tree shadowing them from the rest of the world, Hiccup read the words on the stone. "Here lies Valka Haddock. A loving wife to Stoic, the vast, Haddock and mother to Hiccup Haddock III." And below was her favorite quote, "Some of us were just born different." His eyes blurred quickly as he stood before her, the flowers in his hand gripped tightly as he tried to avoid her gaze. Instead, Hiccup knelt before her stone and placed the bouquet in front of it, laying down her favorite flowers on the ground and sitting cross-legged in front of her. "Hey. Mom." Hiccup started nervously. No words were coming to his mind as he nervously stroked his legs up and down as he sat before her. He was extremely nervous, and he didn't know why. He could talk to his mother about almost anything, but this was the hardest thing to say. "Listen," he began again. "I know I haven't been to see you in a while, and that can't be forgiven, but I got married." Hiccup felt a cold breeze pass over him, as though his mother was there with him. But not by choice. The breeze stopped dead. "I mean, I did choose to agree to the marriage, but Dad was the one who set us up and asked us to agree to the marriage," Hiccup explained, but the breeze did not pick up again. "Her name is Astrid. I think you'd like her. She's strong, capable, stubborn as all of Helheim and beautiful. She's like my dream girl." Hiccup sighed and lowered his head, the breeze gently returning and cascading over his body warmly. "But I don't think she'll ever love me." "I mean, who would? Just look at me. I'm a Hiccup. A weakling, and a failure. I've had everything handed to me, and I still feel like I haven't achieved anything." Hiccup huffed, but another gust of wind slapped him across the back. The breeze picked up and a few leaves around them picked up off the floor, spinning together in an upside-down tornado, spinning behind Valka's gravestone, before flying over the stone and slapping Hiccup in the face. As the leaves fell from his face, his eyes focused back upon her stone and his eye was drawn to the words written upon it. Before, he hadn't taken much notice of them, instead choosing to focus on his name and her name. "Some of us were just born different." Hiccup read aloud in confusion, the words slowly beginning to seep into his skin. Looking up in excitement and eagerness, Hiccup looked up at the stone, reading her name to himself. He beamed brightly. "Do you think she could like me because I'm different?" Hiccup asked, the words dropping from his mouth before he could truly register them. "Is that what you're saying?" The breeze calmed as the leaves slowly made their way back down onto the ground, resting on the ground where they had laid before. Hiccup watched their descent as he thought about Astrid and the relationship they could have. But he quickly shook away the thoughts, bewildered that he was even thinking of them. "What am I saying?" Hiccup slapped himself out of his lovesick trance. We can't be together unless we break the deal. And Astrid would rather be with anyone else than with me. She hates me. Hiccup sighed again. I mean, I purposefully tried flirting with her and I got no reaction from her. Hell, I even cooked with her as an excuse to be extremely close to her, even touching her. But I still didn't get a reaction from her. Hiccup shook his head as he hung it down in disappointment. Instead, all she did was avoid my gaze and freeze up whenever I got close. It's like she thinks I'm some sort of disease she's going to catch. I don't know what else to do. Hiccup rubbed his legs again nervously and frustratingly. Looking at her gravestone, Hiccup smiled at his mother lovingly, showing off his goofy grin. I'm sorry I'm rambling so much, but talking to you always makes me feel better. Thanks, Mom. I know you're always listening and will support me no matter what my decision will be. Chapter 14, Chapter 13. Chapter text. It had been hours since Hiccup had left, and the sun had already fallen beneath the horizon before he arrived back home. Walking through the door, he found the house to be eerily quiet. He wondered whether Astrid had already retired to bed and was currently asleep. However, as he walked past the living room beside the entrance hall, he heard muffled voices from within. Opening the door, he found Astrid sitting with her arms crossed watching the TV. Her gaze was fixed upon the screen and she didn't even react to Hiccup's presence as he entered the room. Inside, Astrid was having an internal conflict with herself. She wanted to turn to him and ask him where he had been all day and make sure that he was okay. On the other hand, she wanted him to beg for her attention. So she decided to keep quiet until the words were rolling from Hiccup's mouth like a waterfall. Hey, Astrid. I'm home. Hiccup announced as he slowly approached the sofa where Astrid was sitting, her arms still crossed over her chest. Hiccup warily sat beside her and looked curiously at her position as she watched the TV. His eyes darted over to the screen to see an action movie playing, but Astrid wasn't showing any reaction to it at all. Was she even aware of what was on? So, what are we watching? Hiccup asked as he sat beside her on the couch, her body momentarily moving due to the shifting weight on the cushions. But Astrid didn't move her gaze from the TV. I think I've seen this before. Have I? Hiccup leaned forward to grab the remote off of the coffee table and checked what was on and nodded to himself. Yeah, I was right. It is this one. He announced to himself, proud of his guess. However, despite his random comments, Astrid remained silent. Hiccup tried to get Astrid to talk, at least a hum of agreement. But he got nothing. Astrid, are you okay? Hiccup finally asked, reaching out to nudge her arm lightly. Did I do something wrong? He asked nervously, and that's when Astrid snapped. Come on, tell me. If you don't tell me what I did wrong, how I am going to know why you're mad at me? Oh, shut up. Astrid suddenly snapped, turning towards him with fury in her eyes. She couldn't take the silence and the constant urge to talk to him that continued to grow within her. Her mission to make him pay by giving him the silent treatment had failed miserably. Astrid looked at Hiccup with a furious stare and it made Hiccup gulp as he felt an uncharacteristically strong sense of fear flowing through his body. What did I do? Hiccup asked innocently. What's wrong? What's wrong? You come home after giving me the cold shoulder this morning, and you're asking me what's wrong. You completely ignored our agreement. Hiccup furrowed his eyebrows. You told me that we should tell each other everything that is bothering us because we'll be living with each other for a while and we'll have to get to know each other. But you. Astrid rolled her eyes mockingly. You were acting so aloof this morning, and then disappeared for the whole day without even telling me where you were going. Did you even think about how worried I was? Astrid asked mindlessly, the words spilling from her mouth before she could stop them. I was almost tempted to lock the door so that you'd stay outside. Hiccup's eyes went wide at her words whilst Astrid scowled and folded her arms over her chest before her words sank in and she slapped a hand over her mouth and shook her head. Astrid turned away from him, her cheeks heating up and blushing like mad as she replayed the words over again in her head. Did she just say that? You were worried? About me? Hiccup asked excitedly, hopefulness filling up his chest. No, Astrid replied coldly, not wanting to look at him. But you just said you were. No, I didn't. Yes, you did. No. Fine. Hiccup said finally, nudging her leg and turning his body towards her on the sofa. Tell me that you weren't worried about me to my face. Look me in the eyes and say it. Hiccup said triumphantly whilst Astrid sighed defeatedly. Come on. I heard you before, say it for me again. Please. All right. I was worried. Happy. Hiccup grinned and nodded happily. Very. Grinning happily, he turned around to face the television, a victorious expression beaming over his features. The idea that Astrid had been worried about his whereabouts filled him with a warm feeling throughout his chest, rising through his body and making him feel slightly hot. But maybe that was just heartburn. Rubbing his thighs nervously, Hiccup glanced over to Astrid, who had crossed her arms over her chest once again in upset. Hiccup wasn't sure what to do at this point. Should he tell her the truth? He knew it had to be worth a shot. Astrid, Hiccup began, gaining Astrid's attention, but she didn't turn to face him. I was too scared to tell you where I was going because I had been putting off going there for a while. I didn't want you to feel like you had to accompany me, it was something I had to do alone. Hiccup explained, sighing heavily as his brow furrowed. I'm sorry that I was like that this morning. Astrid moved closer, tilting her head as she turned to look at him. The words that fell from his mouth intrigued her and she found herself enraptured by his explanation. He didn't know what he had been so upset and anxious about, but she knew that it was something important. Laying a hand upon his thigh, stopping his nervous motions, Astrid smiled up at him. You don't have to tell me if it bothers you this much. I'm fine not knowing. You obviously had some reason for not telling me, I was just being selfish. Astrid apologized sincerely, her words soothing Hiccup's anxiety as he looked into her ocean blue eyes. But he had to tell her. It was eating him from the inside. I went to visit my mother. Astrid looked stunned by his words. I hadn't told her about the wedding, and the whole situation, and I was scared to admit it all. I know my dad probably went to tell her himself, but I still wanted to talk to her about it. Hiccup admitted, dropping his gaze away from Astrid and onto his lap. I promised her that I would marry and be with someone I love, and I just feel like this whole situation is a massive betrayal of my promise to her. This isn't what I promised her, and now it's what I have to do. Hiccup sighed heavily, shaking his head sadly as the words spilled from his mouth. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know. But, why didn't I see her at the wedding? What did your mother say? Astrid asked curiously, the question causing Hiccup to cringe as he realized what she meant. Astrid, she's dead. That's why you didn't see her. The room went silent, apart from the television playing in the background. Astrid stared at Hiccup in shock, her eyes wide and her mouth dropping slightly agape. Her body froze as she realized that she had hit a nerve, and her feelings rattled inside her as her mind went blank. She had messed up. She had messed up big time. Oh, Hiccup. I'm so sorry. Astrid stuttered out, the words tumbling from her mouth before she could string them comprehensible together. It's okay, Astrid, Hiccup chuckled, amused by her stumbling words. You didn't know. Astrid breathed out exasperatedly, her nerves calmed by his soothing words. And besides, it's been years since she passed. I barely know what she looks like because I was so young when she passed. Astrid patted his shoulder gently in a comforting way that filled Hiccup with a warm feeling. Even if he didn't feel like a family, at least he had Astrid trying to be there for him. Both turned back to the television, finally focusing on what was being played on the scene. Hiccup picked up the remote to turn up the volume, but before they knew it the credits were rolling. Oh, I'm sorry I made you miss your movie. Hiccup apologized, but Astrid just laughed with a beaming smile. It was a smile that caused Hiccup to smile back as he felt a warm feeling bubble up within him. It's okay. Truth be told, I wasn't actually watching it. She admitted, playing with her fingers as she spoke. All right then, what do you want to watch? It is still early after all. Hiccup announced, flicking through the channels with the remote. I'll let you choose. When they finally landed upon a movie that sparked particular interest in both of them, they selected it and found themselves fully immersed in the world. The characters on screen spoke to them as if they were in the room with them, their voices carrying across the living room as though they were sitting right next to them watching the movie. After an hour, Astrid found herself drifting off. The gentle ambience of the movie and Hiccup's soothing breaths caused her to slowly close her eyes. Hiccup felt an unusual weight press onto his shoulder. Looking to his side, he saw Astrid's face peacefully asleep there. Smiling, Hiccup stroked a stray hair away from her face and continued to watch the movie, hoping that she would wake up before the end. When the credits finally rolled, Hiccup looked to his side and saw Astrid's head still resting there, her breath slow and peaceful as she was lost in dreamland. Her still face made Hiccup smile unknowingly as he rose from the sofa, whilst holding Astrid's body up and carefully placed Astrid's head on the sofa. Placing a pillow under her head and a blanket over her body to keep her warm, Hiccup left the room and turned off the television and lights. Leaving her sleeping peacefully in the living room, Hiccup made his way to his room and turned in for the night. Astrid stirred as the sun peeked through the curtains in the living room. Stretching her arms up as she yawned loudly, the blanket that had rested over her body fell to the floor and Astrid's legs felt suddenly very cold. Looking around her, she realized that she was still in the living room. "Oh," Astrid muttered to herself as she shot bolt upright on the sofa. Rubbing her face in exasperation, Astrid looked at the blanket that had fallen to the floor and the pillow that her head had rested on. They certainly weren't on her when she had been awake in the living room last night. "Did Hiccup?" Astrid whispered to herself as her gaze locked onto the blanket. "Oh good, you're up." A cheerful voice called out to her, causing Astrid to whip around and face them. Hiccup was entering the living room with 2 cups of steaming liquid, presumably coffee. He offered one out to Astrid as she stayed sat on the sofa, the pillow behind her and the blanket on the floor. Graciously accepting the coffee, Astrid held the mug close and took a small sip from the mug, using it as a hiding place to avoid Hiccup's gaze. "Are you okay?" Hiccup asked curiously, noticing Astrid's avoiding behavior. "I mean, when you fell asleep last night I didn't want to move you, so I just let you sleep here," Hiccup explained as Astrid continued to ignore him, choosing instead to focus on her coffee. Hiccup chuckled to himself as he realized her actions and sat down on the sofa's armrest daintily. Astrid turned further away from him as his gaze pierced through her skin and begged her to turn towards him. "You know, I did try to move you." Hiccup started with a smile on his face. "But you were just so damn heavy that I couldn't even lift your back up off the sofa." Astrid turned to him with a hurt and angry expression. Hiccup laughed at her face and smiled at her warmly. "I was joking. I didn't even try to pick you up without your consent." Astrid's face dropped slightly, removing the anger from her features and focusing back on the coffee. "Your head was just getting too heavy for my shoulder." With that, Hiccup stood up and walked out of the living room. Astrid's cheeks burned red as she registered Hiccup's words. Did she really fall asleep on his shoulders? Did she want to die of a heart attack? Chapter 15, Chapter 14. Chapter text. Adjusting his tie rather forcefully and tiredly, Hiccup looks at his reflection in the mirror. It had only been a week of holiday for him, but it felt as though he was going back to work after a year, and the feeling was unfamiliar to him. Hiccup had never really known holidays, choosing instead to work every day apart from weekends. He always worked and never asked for a day off. There were the obligatory days off that he was forced to take due to company policy, but even during those weeks or days, he would be working. Due to his marriage with Astrid and their new living arrangements, Hiccup hadn't had the chance to work. Instead, Hiccup found himself distracted at home and wishing instead to sit and relax or cook for Astrid. Spending his time with her had become a holiday and luxury to Hiccup, and he had forgotten what going to work felt like. "What is happening to me?" Hiccup questioned himself as he looked at his reflection. This wasn't the same cold businessman he was used to seeing. This man was relaxed and happy. Why can't I just go back to normal? Is this what coming back to work feels like? Hiccup worried as he straightened his suit jacket once more before shaking his head. Get out of your head, Hiccup. Stop overthinking too much. Shaking himself out of his thoughts, Hiccup turned away from his reflection and gathered his briefcase and headed out of his bedroom door. As he opened the door, he was met with Astrid walking out of her room. Both of them stared at each other for a few moments, the silence filling the air between them, increasing the tension before Hiccup cleared his throat. Do you want a lift to work?" Hiccup asked nervously. Astrid looked up from the ground, her bag in hand as she stood before Hiccup. His offer was tempting, but she already felt as though she owed him too much and her pride refused the offer. On the other hand, there was a part of her that was intrigued by the romantic idea of Hiccup taking her to work. Her heart was doing backflips merely thinking about the idea. I don't know. Astrid ambiguously replied, nervously looking away from his stare as he awaited her answer. It won't trouble me if that's what you're afraid of. It's okay, really. I don't mind. Hiccup spluttered, scrambling for the correct things to say to convince Astrid to carpool with him to work. In truth, Hiccup was excited by the idea of taking her to work. Sitting in such close proximity with her, the prospect of accidental skinship sent his mind into overdrive as he thought about the various scenarios. His heart was bursting inside his chest as he thought about the idea. I guess it would be okay. I was just going to take the bus, Astrid muttered, her gaze falling to the side as she replied. No, I insist, Hiccup affirmed, more